The smoke rises first in the imagination, not from one city, but from many. A harbour on the Levantine coast where ships once arrived heavy with copper ingots and jars of oil. A palace in mainland Greece where scribes once pressed records into wet clay. A royal stronghold in Anatolia where messengers once crossed stone courtyards carrying orders from a great king. By the time later generations try to understand what happened, the flames are already gone, the beams have already fallen in, and the names of some of the dead have already disappeared with the roofs above them. What remains is a pattern so unsettling that it still feels almost modern in its logic. An entire world, rich, connected, powerful, and confident, begins to fail across a remarkably short stretch of time. The year 1177 BC is not a magic date, not a single night when civilization everywhere simply goes dark. The evidence remains incomplete, and no ancient observer stands above the eastern Mediterranean with a perfect map, watching every kingdom break at once. Some cities fall earlier, some endure longer, some are burned, some are abandoned, some shrink and survive in diminished form. Yet 1177 BC has become a symbol because it sits near the heart of a catastrophe that overtakes the great powers of the late Bronze Age. Around this moment, the old order is visibly buckling. Hittite authority is vanishing. Mycenaean palace culture is coming apart. Important cities in the Levant are destroyed or weakened. Egypt, one of the mightiest states on earth, fights for survival against enemies arriving by land and sea and emerges battered, still standing, but changed forever. To step into this world at its height is to enter something astonishingly advanced. This is not a primitive age waiting to become history. This is history already in full motion. Kingdoms write letters to one another across hundreds of miles. Diplomats negotiate royal marriages. Merchants move metals, timber, glass, oil, grain, wine, ivory, horses, incense, and dyed textiles along sea lanes and caravan routes that bind distant courts together. Armies march with chariots, composite bows, scale armor and carefully organized supply systems. Palaces keep inventories, priests maintain rituals, artisans work gold into impossible delicacy. Ships cross open water with confidence. Great kings call one another brothers, at least when diplomacy is working. And that is what makes the collapse so eerie. Civilizations do not seem to be dying from isolation or ignorance. They are dying from stress inside a crowded and interconnected system. The more impressive the system appears, the more disturbing its failure becomes. This is one reason the story keeps pulling modern minds back toward it. There is something uncomfortably familiar in the idea that prosperity can hide fragility, that networks designed to create wealth can also spread shock. The strength in one decade can become dependence in the next. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The Old Bronze Age world stretches from the Aegean to Mesopotamia, from Egypt to Anatolia, from the island workshops of Cyprus to the port towns of Canaan. It is not one empire, but a mosaic of states, client kingdoms, ports, enclaves, mercenaries, merchants, and local rulers living under the shadow of larger powers. Egypt dominates the Nile and projects force into the Levant. The Hittite Empire controls much of Anatolia and reaches into northern Syria. Assyria is rising in Mesopotamia. Babylonia endures. The Mycenaean palaces oversee a warrior aristocracy in Greece. Cyprus matters not because it is large, but because it is rich in copper, one of the vital ingredients of bronze. Ugarit, on the Syrian coast, thrives because it sits where roots meet. In this world, geography is never passive. It is opportunity, exposure, and risk all at once. The people living through these years do not know they are standing near the edge of what later historians will call a collapse. Most are occupied with the ordinary business of survival and status. Farmers watch rainfall and soil. Sailors judge winds and currents. Scribes count livestock, grain, weapons, workers, and tribute. Rulers worry about rivals, taxes, labour obligations, and the loyalty of men who command chariots. In workshops, bronze is not a romantic material. It is practical power. To make it, copper must meet tin, and tin is often distant, difficult, and vulnerable to disruption. Already, the world is telling on itself. Its luxury and military capacity depend on long lines of movement that can be interrupted. What survives in the record suggests that this age is both brilliant and brittle. One of the strangest details is how often the great powers write to one another in tones that feel almost personal, even while manoeuvring for advantage. They send gifts, complaints, appeals, and reassurances. A king apologizes for delayed shipments. Another asks for gold. Another protests an insult. Behind the courtesy lies a reality that scholars still debate in all its details. These states are not just neighbours. They are entangled. Food shortages in one region, war in another, piracy on one stretch of sea, unrest in a subject territory, trouble securing raw materials, a failure of harvests, a succession dispute at court. Any of these may travel farther than earlier generations could have imagined. That is why 1177 BC remains such a powerful lens. It allows the collapse to be seen not merely as a sequence of isolated disasters, but as the failure of a system. The phrase sounds modern, but the principle is ancient. A world built on interdependence can be resilient for a long time, until suddenly it is not. Then the very channels that once carried wealth begin to carry panic. The same sea that brings copper and grain may bring raiders. The same diplomatic network that once reduced conflict may spread news of scarcity and weakness. The same palaces that organize production may prove incapable of adapting when the flow of supplies slows, when workers go hungry, when outlying territories pull away, when trust in central authority starts to crack. And yet this is not a simple morality tale about decadence or overreach. The people of the late Bronze Age are not blind fools decorating themselves on the eve of ruin. They are capable, strategic, often astonishingly resilient. Egypt fights off serious attacks. Some cities rebuild more than once. Assyria survives. Cyprus continues in altered ways. Not every place burns, and not every community disappears. That matters, because no single explanation fully accounts for what follows. The old popular image of mysterious invaders arriving from the sea and sweeping civilization away is too neat. So is the idea that drought alone did it, or earthquakes alone, or rebellion alone. The deeper mystery lies in combination. Different pressures strike different places at different moments, but together they seem to overwhelm the system's ability to recover. To understand the darkness that gathers around 1177 BC, it helps to picture the world just before it breaks. A banquet in a palace hall lit by oil lamps, imported pottery on a table, fine textiles hanging in storerooms, chariot parts carefully maintained, bronze blades gleaming, a harbour ledger listing cargoes from overseas, a messenger dismounting after days on the road, a royal seal pressed into clay. In these details there is no obvious prophecy of disaster. That is the haunting part. Collapse rarely announces itself clearly to those inside it. It arrives as shortages, rumours, delayed shipments, rising anxiety, one raid, one failed harvest, one destroyed town, one emergency after another, until the pattern becomes impossible to deny. Then the pattern hardens into absence. Writing vanishes in some places. Monumental building stops. Trade contracts. Populations move. Certain crafts become rarer. Palace centres fall silent. Whole political worlds pass out of use. The Eastern Mediterranean does not become empty, but it becomes poorer, smaller, and more local in many regions. For some, this means violence and dislocation. For others, it means adaptation in the ruins of an older order. The lights do not go out everywhere. They flicker, fail, shift location, and return in altered form. But for those who had lived under the great Bronze Age kingdoms, the change must have felt immense, like the end of a known universe. So the story begins not with one battle or one king, but with a question hanging over burned stones and broken archives. How does a world this sophisticated come apart? Why do so many centres of power weaken or vanish within the same broad span of time? Was this a chain reaction, a convergence of unrelated disasters, or the inevitable result of success that had become too dependent on distance, hierarchy, and constant movement? The ruins do not answer directly. They only insist that something enormous happened here, something larger than a raid, larger than a dynastic quarrel, larger than a local famine. Around 1177 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean enters one of history's great thresholds, and the silence left behind is almost as important as the destruction itself. To understand why the collapse spreads so widely, it is necessary to see what kind of world exists before it begins to fail. This is not a loose collection of isolated kingdoms living behind mountains and deserts, barely aware of one another. It is something far more intricate. By the 13th century BC, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East form a dense international zone, a political and economic web in which powers great and small rely on routes, alliances, cargoes, marriages, and messages moving over land and sea with surprising regularity. The distances remain dangerous, the voyages remain slow, and every journey still depends on weather, local politics, and human endurance. Yet the pattern is unmistakable. These societies are connected enough that trouble in one region can become a problem somewhere else. The map of this world is crowded with names that once carried weight like capitals do now. Egypt stands at the southern edge, immensely wealthy by the standards of the age, anchored by the Nile and ruled by pharaohs who can still project power into Canaan and beyond. To the north rises the Hittite Empire, centered in Anatolia, stretching across highlands and into northern Syria, commanding fortresses, roads, subject rulers, and diplomatic ties. Farther east lie the great kingdoms of Mesopotamia, where Assyria is growing more formidable, and Babylonia remains one of the old centres of civilized prestige. Westward, across the Aegean, the Mycenaean world is divided among palace centres such as Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes, societies organized around warrior elites, storerooms, and carefully managed redistribution. Between these larger powers, the Levantine coast is lined with cities whose importance comes not from vast territory, but from position. Ugarit, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, Ashkelon, and others live by exchange, diplomacy, and maritime reach. Cyprus sits almost like a hinge in the middle of the sea, rich in copper and vital to the production of bronze. Inland and along the margins are vassals, buffer states, highland groups, pastoral peoples, mercenaries, and communities who enter the written record mostly when stronger kingdoms find them useful or threatening. Seen from a palace archive, this world looks coordinated. Kings send envoys, gifts move in both directions, marriage ties bind courts, complaints and requests travel with astonishing specificity. One ruler wants more gold, another wants specialists, another protests that shipments have not arrived. A local prince asks for military support, a governor reports unrest. Scholars still debate the precise degree of integration between all these regions, and the evidence remains uneven from place to place. But what survives in the record suggests a diplomatic culture sophisticated enough to recognize hierarchy, reciprocity, and mutual dependence. Great kings write to other great kings in formal tones of equality, even when everyone understands that equality is fragile and often strategic. Lesser rulers address imperial courts with greater caution. Etiquette matters. Delay matters. A missing gift can become an insult. A missed shipment can become a crisis. The sea is the great connector in this age. For all the danger of storms, reefs, and raiders, maritime routes are often faster and more efficient than overland travel. Ships carry bulk goods that would be agonizingly slow to move by pack animal alone. Along these routes travel copper from Cyprus, timber from the Levant or beyond, oils and wine in large storage jars, crafted objects, resins, glass, textiles, and probably far more organic material than the archaeological record can preserve. Tin, rarer and more difficult to trace, comes from farther away through networks that remain debated, one of the enduring mysteries of Bronze Age trade. That uncertainty itself tells a story. Entire military systems depend on bronze, yet one of its critical ingredients often comes from sources so distant and complex that even now scholars argue over the roots. A system can function impressively for generations while still resting on links that are obscure, narrow, and vulnerable. On land, the roads are no less important, though far more exposed to politics. Caravans and messengers move through mountain passes, river valleys, and contested borderlands. Fortresses watch corridors. Garrisons guard crossings. Grain can be requisitioned. Animals taxed. Labour conscripted. The palaces and courts of the late Bronze Age are not merely luxurious residences. They are administrative engines that gather, count, store, redistribute, and command. Their ability to do this depends on confidence that the wider world will keep moving. A ruler may control a city and the farms around it, but to arm chariots, maintain prestige goods, satisfy allies, and assert place in the international order, local resources are often not enough. The kingdom needs what lies beyond its borders. That dependence creates one of the era's quiet paradoxes. Interconnection makes states richer, stronger, and more sophisticated. It also makes them less self-contained. A city with broad exchange networks can flourish spectacularly, yet may find it harder to absorb disruption when those networks falter. A palace economy can coordinate labour at scale, but can also become rigid. A diplomatic system can reduce the cost of constant warfare, but can produce cascading consequences when trust breaks down. The Late Bronze Age is not weak because it is connected. It is powerful because it is connected. The problem is that connection itself becomes a pathway for failure when several kinds of stress arrive together. This international world also depends on a culture of visible prestige. Rulers do not simply need food and weapons. They need legitimacy, display, and the symbols of high status that prove they belong among the powerful: gold vessels, carved ivory, elaborate furniture, imported luxuries, Fine textiles, decorated chariots, trained horses, and skilled specialists are not decorative extras in the minds of these courts. They are part of kingship itself. To appear diminished is dangerous. A king unable to reward followers, entertain allies, or furnish rituals is a king whose authority may begin to fray. One lesser known but revealing feature of the age is how often practical needs and prestige needs blur together. A shipment of metal may support warfare. A shipment of luxury goods may support diplomacy. A marriage gift may stabilize an alliance. A gift delayed may signal weakness. Material flow is never merely economic. It is political theatre with real consequences. None of this means the world is peaceful. The Bronze Age international system is threaded through with rivalry, coercion, and violence. Empires pressure smaller states. Borderlands are contested. Local rebellions flare. Captives are taken. Mercenaries shift loyalties. Raiding is a constant risk. Royal correspondence, for all its formal politeness, often sits just above threat. Yet even conflict has become part of a recognizable order. War is waged by states that also negotiate treaties, exchange gifts, and know the value of restoring balance when total destruction is too expensive. This is one reason the later breakdown feels so severe. It is not merely that there is violence. There has always been violence. It is that the mechanisms for containing violence appear to fail in multiple regions. At the center of this interconnected world are places that function almost like pressure points. Ugarit is one of the clearest examples. Located on the Syrian coast, it thrives not because it dominates a continent, but because it sits at the crossroads of exchange. Goods pass through, letters pass through, languages and scripts mix. Its archives preserve a world in motion, a world where local elites are tied upward to empires and outward to sea trade. Cyprus is another such pressure point. Its copper makes it indispensable, and indispensability can be dangerous. If a place matters greatly to several networks at once, disruption there radiates outward. The Mycenaean palaces, though separated across the Greek mainland, represent yet another version of concentration. They channel resources, labour, and administration through central complexes. These systems can appear highly efficient, but centralization often means that when the center fails, the whole structure may fail with it. What survives in the record suggests that ordinary people experience this networked world unevenly. For a farmer in an inland village, international diplomacy may seem remote until taxation rises. A harvest fails, troops arrive, or imported metal no longer reaches local workshops. For a dock worker at a coastal city, the pulse of the wider world may be impossible to miss. New cargoes, foreign merchants, unfamiliar speech, rumours of war, delayed arrivals, and changing prices all become part of daily reality. For palace scribes, the world is columns, inventories, allocations, obligations, and the constant need to turn movement into record. There is a human fragility inside this grand system that archaeology only partly captures. Behind every tablet or cargo list stands a chain of people whose lives depend on the assumption that the next shipment will come, the next order will be obeyed, the next season will be tolerable, the next ruler will remain in control. And for a long time, that assumption seems reasonable. The late Bronze Age endures for centuries. Its kingdoms fight, recover, negotiate, and rebuild. This is not a brief bubble. It is a mature order with memory, precedent, and institutional depth. That makes its unravelling even more important. When collapse comes, It is not exposing a toy structure built in haste. It is exposing the underlying vulnerabilities of a world that had learned to run at high complexity for a very long time. The strangeness of 1177 BC then does not lie only in destruction layers or ruined capitals. It lies in the way the crisis appears to move through connection itself, the sea lanes that enriched palaces now expose them. The diplomacy that linked kings now transmits pressure. The trade in metals and grain that supported armies and urban populations now becomes a source of danger when interrupted. Even survival becomes unevenly distributed according to where each society stands inside the web. Some can retreat, adapt, or harden. Others cannot. Some are too dependent on imports. Some are too centralized. Some are already strained by geography, politics, or climate. Once the balance begins to slip, the old international world may still look intact from a distance, but at close range the knots are tightening. That is the stage on which the rest of the mystery unfolds. Before cities burn, before archives fall silent, before later generations inherit the ruins, there exists this extraordinary world of connected kingdoms, proud courts, managed economies, and moving cargoes. It is a system built to extend power across distance. It is also a system that leaves very little margin for simultaneous failure. The greatness of the Late Bronze Age is real. So is the instability hidden inside its success. Once the outlines of this connected world come into view, the next thing that emerges is the machinery inside it, the great apparatus that keeps wealth moving, armies supplied, and kings secure. The Late Bronze Age does not run on markets in the modern sense, nor on simple village self-sufficiency. It runs through palaces, storehouses, workshops, garrisons, temples, and ports. Through systems of collection and redistribution so elaborate that much of what survives from the period is not heroic literature or royal reflection, but accounting, clay tablets, sealed jars, storerooms, inventories, rations, livestock tallies, chariot parts, bronze allocations, perfumed oil, wool, grain, and labour assignments all point to the same underlying reality. Power is organised, measured, and concentrated. At the centre of many of these societies stands the palace. In some places it is a royal residence. In others it is also an archive, a warehouse, a ritual centre, an administrative headquarters, and a symbol of the political order itself. It is where tribute arrives, where goods are counted, where specialists work under elite supervision, where scribes turn movement into memory, and where authority becomes visible in stone, timber, fresco, and controlled abundance, in Mycenaean Greece. The palace complexes at places like Pylos and Mycenae are not merely homes for rulers. They are the heart of an entire redistributive structure. Sheep are counted for wool production. Bronze is allocated to smiths. Wheels, leather, and horse gear are tracked. Women workers appear in tablets as organised labour forces attached to textile production. The palace does not just possess wealth, it channels and defines it. In Anatolia and Syria, imperial administration takes a somewhat different form, but the principle is similar. Great kings depend on subordinate rulers, tax flows, agricultural production, military obligations, and the dependable movement of information. A capital such as Hattusa, seat of the Hittite kings, is not simply impressive because it is large or fortified. It matters because from there authority spreads across a broad and uneven realm, one held together by treaties, roads, garrisons, diplomatic marriages, threats, and negotiated loyalties. What survives in the record suggests that many Bronze Age states are highly capable, but rarely all-powerful. They must constantly convert resources into control. That conversion depends on stable harvests, transport, and obedience. Even an empire can look immense and still be vulnerable to disruption at several points at once. The material at the center of this world is bronze, and bronze is never just metal. It is military readiness, agricultural efficiency, aristocratic display, and state capacity in alloyed form. To make bronze in substantial quantity, copper must be mixed with tin. Copper is comparatively easier to source in the eastern Mediterranean, with Cyprus especially important. Tin is the stranger ingredient, more elusive in both ancient and modern terms. Its sources may reach deep into Anatolia, Central Asia, or beyond through complex exchange systems still debated by scholars. That uncertainty matters because it shows how far some dependencies extend beyond what palace inscriptions can fully explain. A sword in a Mycenaean storehouse or a spearhead in a Levantine garrison may depend on extraction, transport, trade, and political cooperation across astonishing distances. A weapon in one place reflects stability in many others. This is one reason the Bronze Age world can seem so sophisticated and so precarious at the same time. Specialization has deepened. Not every community makes everything for itself. Some regions excel in copper, some in timber, some in horse breeding, some in textiles, some in luxury craftsmanship, some in strategic location. A king who wants to equip warriors, reward followers, and maintain prestige cannot simply look inward. He needs access. He needs roots. He needs predictability. In prosperous years, this arrangement is a source of immense power. Workshops can produce fine goods at scale. Elites can distinguish themselves through imported luxuries. Palaces can distribute rations and raw materials to dependent workers. Armies can be armed not just with courage but with standardized material. The wider the web reaches, the more impressive the center becomes. The ships of the age reveal this economic logic with particular clarity. Maritime transport allows bulky materials to move in quantities over long distances that would be punishing by land. Cargoes of copper ingots, jars of oil or wine, timber, glass, resins, luxury objects, and perhaps grain make the sea a moving bloodstream for the system. One of the most extraordinary glimpses into this world comes from shipwreck evidence, especially the famous Uluburun wreck, which carries an astonishing mix of goods from different regions. It is less a random collection than a floating summary of the late Bronze Age international economy raw materials. Finished objects, prestige items, and signs of contact between cultures that modern maps sometimes treat separately. One lesser-known and striking detail is how much such cargoes imply trust in systems beyond a single kingdom's control. For a ship loaded with wealth to leave harbour, many assumptions must hold at once. Routes must remain open. Partners must remain trustworthy. Coastal stations must function, and destination elites must still have the means to receive and redistribute what arrives. Palace wealth is also agricultural wealth, and here the logic becomes even more delicate. Great centres depend on surrounding fields, herds, irrigation where possible, labour obligations, and storage. Grain is not glamorous like gold or ivory, but it is the foundation beneath everything else. Urban populations, armies, court officials, craft specialists, and transport animals all consume enormous resources. A palace economy that appears strong in times of good harvest may prove rigid in times of shortage. Food must move on schedule, rations must be issued, dependent workers must be maintained, officials must be paid. A poor year is dangerous. a run of poor years can become a political problem. Scholars still debate how evenly these burdens fall and how much flexibility local communities retain. But no single explanation fully accounts for the durability or collapse of the system. What seems clear is that concentration magnifies both power and risk. When storage and administration succeed, they create resilience. When they fail, many people are exposed at once. The chariot aristocracy adds another layer to this world of stored wealth and organized force. Chariots are not simple battlefield vehicles for rough terrain. They are expensive military platforms and elite symbols requiring horses, skilled maintenance, leatherwork, carpentry, bronze fittings, training, and status. To field them in serious numbers is to demonstrate organizational capacity. It also means that military power is tied to specialists, supply chains, and landowners who can support the system around them. In many Bronze Age societies, warriors are not detached from the economy, they are embedded in it. Land, rank, tribute, and palace favour all help sustain martial elites whose loyalty matters deeply when the state comes under stress. If shortages rise, if rulers cannot reward followers, if political confidence weakens, the military and social order may fray together. Writing itself is part of this machinery. In the Mycenaean world, linear B tablets largely record administration rather than poetry or philosophy. In the Near East, cuneiform archives preserve treaties, correspondence, and transactions. These are not the idle products of literate courts. They are tools of coordination. To write down shipments, labour, and obligations is to make a complex system manageable across time. But there is a haunting irony here. The records survive best at the moment of destruction, when fired accidentally in the very conflagrations that destroy the buildings around them. A palace archive may reach modern archaeologists because the palace burns hot enough to preserve its tablets. The bureaucracy speaks most clearly when it is dying. We know some of these systems precisely because they failed catastrophically. There is another paradox inside this world, quieter, but just as important. The palatial economies generate brilliance in art, craftsmanship, and ceremony, yet they may also narrow the channels through which resources flow. The centre becomes efficient. But efficiency is not the same as adaptability. A decentralized village network can survive with less splendor. A palace-centered world can produce frescoes, armor, diplomatic gifts, monumental halls, and high-level coordination. But it may struggle when one major corridor closes or one key input disappears. If bronze is delayed, if grain falters, if shipping becomes dangerous, if subject rulers stop cooperating, the effects may reach the centre quickly. Wealth that once seemed proof of permanence can become evidence of dependence. And still, from within the system, none of this necessarily looks fatal. A king sees tribute arriving, ships docking, workshops producing, and scribes recording. An elite household sees storerooms and horse teams. A merchant sees demand. A smith sees work. A priest sees offerings continuing. The order may feel ancient and durable because it has already survived wars, succession struggles, and regional shortages before. That confidence is understandable. Many complex societies do not collapse the first time they experience stress. They absorb it. They negotiate. They improvise. The Late Bronze Age has every reason to believe it can continue doing so. Yet the details already carry a warning. A world dependent on bronze must protect access to copper and tin. A world dependent on palaces must keep those palaces functioning. A world dependent on centralized administration must preserve both records and obedience. A world dependent on prestige must keep elite confidence intact. A world dependent on long-distance movement must prevent the seas and roads from becoming corridors of disruption instead of exchange. Each element strengthens the whole when conditions are favorable. Each element also becomes a point of failure when conditions worsen. This is why the prosperity of the age cannot be separated from the danger that follows. The brilliance of the late Bronze Age is not the backdrop to collapse. It is part of the explanation. The very structures that make these kingdoms rich, organized, and formidable also make them exposed to interruption on a scale simpler societies might never face. Their wealth sits in storerooms. Their armies rely on inputs from afar. Their legitimacy depends on display. Their bureaucracy depends on centers. Their metals depend on roots. Their political order depends on motion. By the time later centuries look back, much of this machinery is gone or transformed beyond easy recognition. But just before the old world begins to buckle, the system is still running. Ships still move across the sea. Bronze is still cast into tools and weapons. Scribes still press signs into clay. Palaces still command labor and issue rations. Kings still imagine that the networks enriching them will continue to hold. The collapse will become terrifying precisely because so much of this seems normal right until it does not. At its height, the late Bronze Age does not feel like a world on the edge of collapse. It feels like a world that has already mastered complexity. The great kingdoms are not merely surviving, they are projecting confidence across land and sea, reinforcing their place in a system that has endured for generations. From the perspective of those living within it, there are few reasons to suspect that this structure, however intricate, is about to fracture in ways that will echo for centuries. Across the eastern Mediterranean, a monumental architecture rises as a visible expression of order and control. In Mycenaean Greece, massive stone walls, later called Cyclopean, because of their sheer scale in circle citadels perched on strategic heights. Within them, palaces are decorated with frescoes showing processions, hunting scenes, and symbols of elite life. Storerooms hold carefully measured goods. Administrative tablets record allocations with precision. These are not temporary settlements. They are statements of permanence. In Anatolia, the Hittite capital of Hattusa stands as one of the most impressive centers of its time, with fortified gates, administrative buildings, and temples that reflect a powerful state able to mobilize labor and resources on a grand scale. Its rulers negotiate with Egypt, command armies across wide territories, and manage a network of vassal states that extend their reach far beyond the city itself. The very existence of such a system suggests stability, or at least the ability to impose it. Egypt, perhaps the most enduring of all these civilizations, enters this period with immense wealth and long memory. Its temples are filled with offerings, its monuments inscribed with victories, its bureaucracy capable of coordinating labor along the Nile in ways unmatched by many of its neighbors. Grain surpluses support large populations. Skilled artisans produce objects of remarkable quality. The pharaoh is not just a political leader, but a divine figure, reinforcing a sense that the order of the world itself is anchored in Egyptian continuity. Along the Levantine coast, cities like Ugarit flourish as hubs of exchange and culture. Their ports are busy with ships arriving from distant lands. Their archives preserve multiple languages and scripts, reflecting a cosmopolitan environment where trade and diplomacy intersect. Goods flow through their markets. Ideas travel with merchants and envoys. These are places where the wider world feels close, immediate, and alive with opportunity. Cyprus continues to play its crucial role as a supplier of copper, feeding the demand for bronze that underpins both military and economic power. Workshops across the region transform raw materials into tools, weapons, and luxury goods. The circulation of metal connects distant regions into a shared technological and economic framework, one that appears both efficient and resilient. What makes this moment so striking is the degree to which everything seems to function at once. Ships sail, letters arrive, alliances hold, or at least hold enough. Harvests, while never guaranteed, are often sufficient to sustain both populations and elite expectations. Armies remain organized. Kings maintain authority. The machinery described earlier is not hypothetical. It is visibly operating. There is also a cultural richness that reflects long-term stability. Artistic styles travel across regions, adapting and blending. Religious practices continue with established rituals. Writing systems, though varied, serve administrative and ceremonial purposes. Knowledge accumulates, even if it is often tied to practical needs rather than abstract inquiry. The world is not static, but it is coherent. Yet beneath this coherence, subtle imbalances are already present. Scholars still debate how visible these tensions would have been to contemporaries, but what survives in the record suggests that prosperity is not evenly distributed. Palaces concentrate wealth and control. Rural populations carry much of the burden of production. Peripheral regions may experience the demands of the system more as pressure than as benefit. These are not necessarily new conditions. But in a highly interconnected system, their effects can accumulate. There is also the matter of scale. The Late Bronze Age world operates at a level of integration that requires constant maintenance. Trade routes must remain open. Political relationships must be managed. Supply chains must function without major interruption. The larger and more interconnected the system becomes, the more it depends on stability across multiple regions simultaneously. A disruption in one area can be absorbed. Several disruptions at once begin to test the limits. One of the more revealing aspects of this period is how often success depends on predictability. A king expects tribute to arrive. A merchant expects safe passage. A farmer expects a harvest within a certain range. A workshop expects materials to continue flowing. These expectations are rarely guaranteed, but they form the baseline against which planning occurs. When predictability holds, the system feels secure. When it begins to falter, uncertainty spreads quickly. What survives in the record suggests that the Late Bronze Age does not collapse because it is weak, but because it is stretched. Its systems are efficient but tightly coupled. Its economies are productive but dependent. Its politics are organized but often hierarchical and rigid. These qualities allow for remarkable achievements, yet they also reduce flexibility when conditions change rapidly. There is a quiet irony in how the signs of strength double as potential points of failure. Monumental architecture reflects the ability to mobilize labor, but also ties resources to fixed centers that must be maintained. Extensive trade networks create wealth, but also create reliance on distant stability. Centralized administration allows coordination, but can struggle to adapt when communication breaks down or local conditions shift unexpectedly. Even the sense of continuity, so strong in places like Egypt, can obscure emerging risks. A civilization that has endured for centuries may interpret new challenges through the lens of past resilience, assuming that recovery is always possible. In many cases, that assumption has been correct, but history does not guarantee repetition. Conditions can align in ways that overwhelm even well-established systems. There are hints, small and scattered, that something is beginning to change. Not yet a collapse, not yet a crisis visible everywhere, but a shift in tone, letters that express urgency, requests for aid that suggest strain, movements of people that are not fully explained, local disruptions that seem manageable on their own. At first, these signs do not form a clear pattern. They are part of the normal background of a complex world. But complexity has a way of amplifying coincidence. When multiple stresses occur within overlapping networks, they can reinforce one another. A failed harvest in one region may increase demand elsewhere. Increased demand may strain trade routes. Strained routes may become targets for raids. Raids may disrupt supply further. Each step is understandable. Together, they begin to push the system toward a threshold. Still, for those living in this moment, the threshold is invisible. There is no clear line between stability and collapse, only a gradual accumulation of pressure. The great palaces continue to function, the kings continue to rule, the ships continue to sail. The world from the inside still appears intact. And that is what makes the coming transformation so difficult to grasp even in hindsight. It is not the sudden fall of a single empire that defines this period, but the unravelling of a network that has grown too interconnected to fail quietly. The Late Bronze Age reaches its peak not as a fragile experiment, but as a mature system that has learned to operate across distance, diversity, and complexity. In that maturity lies both its achievement and its vulnerability. The Golden Age is real. The wealth, the organization, the cultural exchange, the political sophistication, all of it exists, and all of it matters. But it also creates a world where disruption can travel farther, faster, and with greater impact than before. This stage is set not for a single catastrophe, but for a convergence. A world that appears stable on the surface is beginning to carry stresses that it may not be able to absorb indefinitely. The palaces stand, the archives grow, the trade routes hum with activity, yet somewhere within this system the balance is shifting. And when that balance finally breaks, it will not be confined to one place. It will move through the very connections that once made this world great, turning strength into exposure and prosperity into something far more fragile than anyone within it fully understands. The first signs are easy to mistake for noise, a delayed shipment, a local revolt, a request for grain, a complaint preserved in clay from a ruler who sounds more strained than his title would suggest, a raid on a coast that is usually busy with merchants, a palace still functioning, but perhaps a little more anxiously than before. Collapse in the ancient world rarely begins with a trumpet blast. More often it starts in the margins of the record, in fragments that seem ordinary until later destruction gives them a terrible clarity. What survives from the years before the Great Unravelling suggests that the Late Bronze Age world begins to warn itself long before it visibly falls apart. The warnings are not always dramatic. In some cases, they survive as diplomatic correspondence full of requests, excuses, and urgency. In others, they appear in archaeology as signs of stress rather than final destruction. Fortifications strengthened, settlements shifted, caches buried, trade patterns altered, administrative habits changing in subtle ways. Scholars still debate how to align these clues precisely across regions, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the general impression is difficult to escape. The old system does not move from health to ruin in a single leap. It trembles first. One of the most haunting kinds of evidence comes from letters written by people who do not know they are becoming the prelude to catastrophe. At Ugarit and elsewhere, archives preserve appeals and reports that suddenly feel alarmingly close to collapse. There are requests for military help. There are signs that enemies are moving in ways no one can easily control. There are moments when officials are clearly struggling to respond to threats faster than the system around them can process them. These texts do not read like the final chapter of civilization. They read like administration under pressure, which is precisely why they matter. A world order often reveals its weakness not in epic declarations, but in frantic paperwork. The city of Ugarit is especially revealing because it stands so squarely inside the international system. It thrives on connectivity, diplomacy, and trade, and for that same reason it is exquisitely sensitive to disruption. In its last years, the correspondence that survives suggests mounting anxiety. Messages imply that hostile forces are active, ships are absent when needed, defences are strained, responses are delayed. There is something chilling in the tone of these documents. The machinery of the old world is still technically in place. Kings still write, officials still report, commands are still issued, but the confidence that once sustained the whole structure seems thinner now, as if each message assumes a level of control that reality is already beginning to withdraw. Along the coastlines and frontier zones, raids become harder to dismiss as local irritations. Maritime predation is not new in this world, nor is border violence, but what survives in the record suggests an increase in instability that no single kingdom can fully contain. Merchants depend on routes staying predictable. Ports depend on arrivals being more common than attacks. Coastal cities can survive occasional violence. What they struggle to survive is the erosion of confidence that turns every voyage into a risk and every delay into a possible disaster. Once enough, captains hesitate. Enough cargoes fail to arrive. Enough rumours of attack spread. The economy begins to tighten long before the final destruction layer appears. Elsewhere, shortage begins to show itself in more practical ways. Requests for grain matter enormously in the ancient world because grain is not merely one commodity among many. It is the difference between continuity and disorder. In a palace-centered system, food shortages do not stay local for long. A poor harvest can raise prices, intensify taxation, strain labor obligations, and weaken loyalty to ruling centers. If neighboring regions are also stressed, the usual strategy of importing relief becomes harder. What survives in the record suggests that some areas of the eastern Mediterranean are already experiencing serious pressure before the full wave of collapse arrives. Scholars still debate exactly how severe the shortages are in each place, but no single explanation fully accounts for the pattern unless subsistence stress is included somewhere in the chain. There are also hints in architecture and settlement behaviour. Communities do not always wait for final disaster before changing how they live. Some strengthen walls, some move to more defensible locations, some reduce investment in large public or ceremonial structures, and focus instead on immediate survival. In archaeology, these can be difficult signals to interpret. A stronger wall may reflect routine politics rather than crisis. A shift in settlement pattern may have several causes. Yet when such changes appear alongside disrupted trade, emergency correspondence, and eventual destruction, they begin to look less like isolated local decisions and more like a world becoming wary of itself. The palace archives of Mycenaean Greece offer another subtle warning. At Pylos, for example, the Linear B tablets from the final period include evidence of coastal watch arrangements and preparations that suggest concern about attack. The details are limited, and scholars continue to argue about how directly they point to incoming seaborne threats, but the atmosphere is unmistakable. the bureaucracy is turning toward defense. That matters because these tablets belong to a society whose administrative energy usually centers on allocation, production, landholding, and ritual order. When a palace begins recording emergency readiness, even in fragments, it hints that the horizon has darkened. This stage of the story is important because it resists the temptation to imagine collapse as a single dramatic blow from outside. The old world is already under strain before many of its most famous destructions occur. Systems appear overloaded. Political relationships may be stiffening. Regional authorities may be less reliable. Subject populations may be less willing to endure demands from distant centers. The great kingdoms still stand, but they are standing with more effort than before. They have not yet failed, but they may already be losing flexibility, and flexibility is often what determines whether a crisis becomes a setback or a ruin. One lesser known but revealing detail is how silence itself begins to matter. In a well-connected international system, absence is information. A ship that does not arrive on time is not only a commercial inconvenience. It may signal danger on the route, trouble at the point of origin, or fear among sailors and merchants. A court that does not answer quickly may be facing internal problems. A shipment of metal delayed too long may ripple outward into military, diplomatic, and economic strain. Ancient states do not need modern data systems to sense instability. They feel it through interruption. The rhythm changes, and everyone who depends on the rhythm feels it. By the time some of the most visible catastrophes occur, many parts of the system may already be brittle. That brittleness is easy to miss if the story is told only through final ruins. A city burns, and the mind naturally focuses on the fire, but the fire may be the end of a longer weakening. A palace falls, and it is tempting to imagine one decisive enemy, yet the decisive enemy may arrive only after years of shortage, military overstretch, political fatigue, and broken supply. What survives in the record suggests that the Late Bronze Age collapse is not simply a tale of strong states suddenly overwhelmed. It is also a tale of strong states gradually made less strong by accumulating pressure. This is where the mystery deepens rather than clears. The warning signs are real, but they do not point to one universally shared cause. In one region, drought may be the sharper pressure. In another, raiding or migration. In another, dynastic trouble. In another, breakdown in trade. The evidence varies, and scholars still debate how tightly synchronized these stresses are. But the broad pattern remains persuasive. The old order is not taken by surprise in a single instant. It senses danger, responds unevenly, and still fails to stop what is coming. There is something deeply human in this stage of the collapse. Administrators keep writing, defenders keep watching the coast, officials keep requesting support, farmers keep hoping for a stable season, merchants keep calculating whether a voyage is still worth the risk. Rulers keep assuming that the next intervention, the next treaty, the next shipment, the next display of force might restore the balance. None of these responses is irrational. Most are exactly what functioning states and ordinary people do under pressure. But pressure has a way of revealing how narrow the margin already is. In retrospect, the warnings seem almost unbearably clear. The urgent letters, the food stress, the defensive preparations, the signs of interrupted movement, the growing instability along coasts and frontiers all suggest that the old Bronze Age world is entering a period when shocks will no longer remain containable. Yet hindsight is merciless. To those living through it, each warning may still have seemed manageable. One more problem in a world that had handled many problems before. That is often how collapse advances. not as an obvious ending, but as a sequence of emergencies treated as temporary, until the temporary becomes permanent and the system that once absorbed strain begins instead to magnify it. Soon the signs in the margins will become harder to ignore. The warnings will stop being whispers in letters and adjustments in policy. They will become ash, abandonment, and broken dynasties. But before the fire comes the unease, and before the silence comes the sound of a world still trying to answer its own alarms. Then the fires become visible. Archaeology has a cruel clarity when it reaches this stage. A destruction layer is not an argument in itself, not a complete explanation, but it is a moment fixed in material form. Burned beams collapse inward, mud brick walls redden under intense heat, storage jars crack, roofs fall onto floors where tools, ornaments, tablets, and bones are trapped beneath debris. In some places the damage is repaired and life resumes. In others the break is deeper. Occupation contracts, shifts, or disappears. A harbour that once received foreign cargo becomes quieter. A palace that once redistributed grain and bronze is left as a shell. Across large parts of the eastern Mediterranean near the end of the Late Bronze Age, these signs begin to appear with troubling frequency. The image of cities burning can easily become too dramatic, too simple, as though one wave of attackers sweeps from shore to shore and leaves nothing behind but ash. The evidence is more uneven than that. Not every city is destroyed. Not every destruction is caused by the same force. Some places suffer repeated damage across decades. Others decline without a single spectacular blaze. Some are abandoned gradually. Some survive but shrink. Scholars still debate the chronology and exact causes site by site, and the evidence remains incomplete. Yet what survives in the ground suggests that the later 13th and early 12th centuries BC bring an extraordinary spread of violent disruption to urban centres, ports, and palace sites. The pattern is too broad to dismiss as routine ancient warfare. In the Greek world, the Mycenaean palaces begin to fall silent. At Pylos, the palace is destroyed by fire around the end of the 13th century BC. The clay tablets preserved there owe their survival to that same destruction, hardened by the blaze that ends the administrative life of the centre. The final records hint at military concern, watch stations, defensive measures, and organised readiness. But whatever preparations are made do not save the palace, its storerooms, archives, and bureaucratic routines vanish with the fire. Similar endings or severe disruptions appear at Mycenae, Tiryns, Thebes, and other major centres, though the timing and details vary. The point is not perfect simultaneity. The point is systemic failure. The palatial world that had coordinated power and production across Mycenaean Greece is coming apart. Along the Levantine coast, destruction is no less striking. Ugarit, once one of the most connected and literate cities in the region, is destroyed and never regains its old role. The end comes with an almost unbearable sense of interruption. Letters survive. Goods are still moving or meant to move. Officials are still trying to respond. Then the city is gone as a major player. The archives do not conclude the story with dignity. They are simply cut off. That abruptness matters. It suggests not merely decline, but breakdown too fast for normal recovery. Other coastal cities also suffer devastation, though not always in identical ways. What had been a zone of exchange becomes, in many places, a zone of exposure. In Anatolia, the disappearance of Hittite power is one of the most dramatic political consequences of the period. Hattusa, the imperial capital, is abandoned and destroyed in the turbulence of the age. The exact sequence remains debated, and no single explanation fully accounts for how an empire of such scale vanishes from the political map. But vanish it does. The state that had negotiated with Egypt as an equal, commanded armies, and ruled through treaties and vassals ceases to function as the same imperial system. In southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, smaller successor states endure in altered form, preserving fragments of Hittite culture and language, but the great central structure is gone. The destruction of cities here is not just local tragedy, it is imperial disintegration made visible. Further south, Canaanite urban centers experience a mixed but often violent transformation. Some cities are destroyed, some are rebuilt under changed conditions, some continue with different populations or political arrangements. The archaeological record is complicated, and later identities are not always easy to map cleanly onto earlier destruction horizons. Even so, the broad trend is unmistakable. The old urban network of the late Bronze Age is disrupted, administrative ties weaken. Egyptian influence recedes in many places. New local realities emerge from the wreckage. In some towns, imported goods become rarer. In others, architecture changes. What had been part of a wider imperial and diplomatic framework becomes more fragmented, more regional, and often poorer. One lesser known but important detail is that destruction by fire does not always mean conquest in the narrow sense. Cities can burn during civil unrest, accidental spread in wartime, hurried evacuation, or conflict involving factions within a society as well as outside enemies. A palace sacked by rebels or abandoned under famine may leave ruins that, centuries later, look at first glance like evidence of a foreign invasion. This is one reason archaeologists proceed cautiously. Burn layers are eloquent, but they do not name the hand that lit them. What they do reveal is the failure of order, whether the agent is invader, insurgent, rival kingdom, or some combination. The result is the same centers that once concentrated wealth, authority, and memory are no longer secure. At some sites, signs of hurried endings deepen the sense of crisis. Goods are left behind that might normally have been removed. Administrative materials remain where they were used. Storage contexts suggest interruption rather than orderly departure. These details hint that some communities either cannot escape in time or do not realize the finality of the threat until too late. Elsewhere, there are signs that people do flee, returning later only in diminished numbers or not at all. The evidence varies from site to site, but what survives in the record suggests a world increasingly unable to distinguish temporary danger from terminal collapse until the terminal collapse has already arrived. The spread of destruction does something else as well. It begins to sever the links that allow recovery. One burned city is a tragedy. Several burned ports are a regional crisis. A palace destroyed in one kingdom may be compensated for by trade or alliance with another. But if multiple centers are damaged across the same broad period, the possibilities for substitution narrow. A merchant seeking a safer harbour may find the next harbour also unstable. A ruler seeking grain may find neighbouring regions equally strained. A displaced population moving toward another political centre may find that centre already under pressure. This is where the collapse starts to behave less like a chain of isolated disasters and more like a network entering cascading failure. And yet the destruction is not universal. Egypt remains standing. Assyria survives. Some cities rebuild. Some rural communities continue with less visible disruption than the palaces that once dominated them. This unevenness is essential. It prevents the story from becoming myth. The late Bronze Age collapse is not the end of all civilization. nor a single synchronized apocalypse. It is a broad, deeply transformative breakdown of major political and economic systems across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Its scale is immense without being total. Its violence is real without being uniform. Its mystery lies partly in that uneven distribution, why this centre falls completely while another adapts, why this city burns while another contracts quietly, why one kingdom disappears and another limps on. For those living through the destructions, however, the distinctions may matter less than the atmosphere they create. Fire in one great centre sends refugees outward, interrupts trade, erases archives, and signals weakness to enemies. News of one palace falling alters expectations elsewhere. Loyalty becomes more conditional. Fear becomes more rational. The burning of cities is not only physical devastation, it is information. It tells everyone that the old protections are no longer reliable. Once enough people believe that the political world changes even before the last walls fall, there is a terrible intimacy to destruction layers. They preserve not just events, but moments of ordinary life overtaken by extraordinary force. A cup left on a floor, a tool in a workshop, a seal in an office, a tablet not yet filed away. These remains remind us that collapse is experienced not by abstractions, but by people who wake expecting another day in a functioning world, and instead find that world ending room by room. The great historical mystery is large, but it is built from these smaller shocks: the heat of burning timber, the confusion of flight, the silence after administrative routines stop. By now the warning signs of the previous years have become something harsher and harder to ignore. The old system is no longer merely strained. In many places it is visibly breaking. Cities begin burning not as isolated accidents, but as part of a larger horizon of destruction that cuts through palace economies, coastal exchange, imperial authority, and urban life. The ruins do not yet tell us why everything is happening. They only insist that it is happening on a scale no ruler of the age could comfortably absorb. The world of kings, cargoes, archives, and managed abundance is entering its most violent phase, and in the flames the next great argument of history begins to take shape: who or what is actually bringing it down. Among all the explanations attached to the late Bronze Age collapse, none has captured the imagination more completely than the Sea Peoples. The name itself seems to arrive already wrapped in mystery. It suggests movement over open water, hostile fleets on dark horizons, displaced populations arriving at the edges of old kingdoms, and a kind of historical force that is both human and strangely anonymous. It is one of those phrases that feels as if it should explain everything. That, perhaps, is exactly why it must be handled carefully. The strongest reason the Sea Peoples loom so large is Egypt. In the reigns of Merneptah and later Rameses III, Egyptian inscriptions and reliefs describe conflicts against groups arriving from outside the usual frame of royal order. Some are named, some are shown in battle scenes, some appear by sea, some by land, and some seem to move with families and carts rather than as simple raiding bands. In the inscriptions of Rameses III at Medinet Habu, these enemies are presented as a grave danger to the established world, a coalition that has already overrun other lands before turning toward Egypt. It is from such texts that the modern imagination draws much of its picture: a wave of marauding outsiders smashing the Bronze Age kingdoms one after another until only Egypt manages to resist them. There is some truth in this image, but not enough to let it stand on its own. Egyptian inscriptions are royal propaganda as well as historical evidence. Their purpose is not detached reporting. Their purpose is to magnify pharaonic victory, justify kingship and frame Egypt as the bastion of order against chaos, that does not make them false, but it does mean they must be read with caution. The sea peoples in Egyptian records are real adversaries, yet the records do not provide a neat ethnographic map of who all these people are, where they originate, how unified they are, or whether they are best understood as invaders, migrants, mercenaries, refugees, opportunistic raiders, or some shifting combination of all four. This uncertainty is not a weakness of scholarship. It is part of the reality of the problem. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate whether the term sea peoples, useful as shorthand, creates the illusion of a single coherent force where there may instead have been several different groups moving under very different pressures. Names like Shurden, Shekelesh, Peleset, Jeka, Denian, and Weshesh appear in Egyptian texts, but attaching each of them securely to a specific homeland or identity remains difficult. Some may have Aegean connections, some may come from Anatolia or the central Mediterranean, some may have been circulating within Eastern Mediterranean military systems long before they appear as enemies in Egyptian inscriptions. A label can make the past look tidier than it was. One of the most important correctives to the old popular picture is the recognition that these groups do not necessarily stand outside the Bronze Age world in any simple sense. Some may have served as mercenaries for the very states now collapsing. Some may have originated in regions already destabilized by war, famine, or political breakdown. Some may have been displaced populations moving in search of land, subsistence, or security. In other words, they may be less the external cause of collapse than one visible symptom of collapse already underway. If the great kingdoms have begun to weaken, if food shortages and conflict are spreading, if coastal defences are thinning and old diplomatic systems are failing, then mobile armed groups and migrating communities become far more likely. The sea peoples may not be the hammer striking a stable world from outside. They may be one of the shapes instability takes inside a world already breaking. This possibility changes the tone of the story. Instead of imagining a civilized order destroyed by faceless barbarians from beyond the sea, the collapse begins to look more like a redistribution of people and violence across a stressed landscape. That does not make the danger less real. For cities on exposed coasts, for shipping routes, for weakened kingdoms, mobile seaborne groups could be devastating. A state dependent on imported supplies and vulnerable ports does not need a continent-sized invasion to suffer catastrophic disruption. It needs only enough repeated raiding, enough attacks on harbours, enough fear among merchants, enough inability to protect coastlines, and enough movement of armed populations to turn connectivity into liability. The Egyptian battle scenes themselves suggest complexity. At Medinet Habu, Rameses III depicts enemies arriving not only as fighters but, in some representations, with ox carts and family groups. This detail has long attracted attention because it implies more than raiding. Raiders do not usually bring households into battle zones unless they are also moving as settlers, displaced communities, or migrating confederations. What survives in the record suggests that at least some of the groups Egypt confronts are not simply piracy at scale. They may represent whole populations on the move, perhaps driven by pressures elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. If so, they become part of a larger crisis of displacement, one in which the collapse of one region helps destabilize the next. There is also the awkward matter of chronology. Some destructions associated in popular writing with the Sea Peoples happen before the famous Egyptian encounters. Some areas decline without strong evidence of seaborne attack at all. The Hittite Empire disappears in ways that cannot be reduced to a single naval phenomenon. Inland regions suffer too. Drought evidence, famine signals, political fragmentation, and local rebellions do not vanish simply because dramatic relief carvings exist in Egypt. No single explanation fully accounts for the collapse if the Sea Peoples are treated as the master key. They are part of the story, perhaps an important part, but not the whole of it. Even the term invasion may mislead. In modern historical imagination, invasion often implies a unified people with a stable homeland, a leadership structure, and a clear objective of conquest. The groups recorded by Egypt may instead represent fluid coalitions formed under pressure, opportunistic alliances of warriors, displaced families, local adventurers, mercenaries changing sides, and communities uprooted by crises elsewhere. Such coalitions can be less stable and more dangerous precisely because they are driven by immediate need rather than orderly imperial planning. A starving kingdom may negotiate with a rival. A mobile armed population may simply move toward the nearest vulnerable wealth. One lesser known but revealing possibility is that collapsing states themselves may have helped produce the Sea Peoples phenomenon. Bronze Age kingdoms rely heavily on professional fighters, dependent elites, and military networks that can fragment under strain. If palaces fail to pay, feed, or command armed men, those men do not vanish. They may join raids. They may attach themselves to migrating groups. They may become the military core of new coalitions. A system breaking apart can release violence into wider circulation, turning trained soldiers into free actors. In that sense, the Sea Peoples may be partly made from the debris of the very order they helped destroy. This would explain why they appear both familiar and elusive. Familiar, because they may carry weapons, tactics, and equipment shaped by the Bronze Age world. Elusive, because once old political structures crack, identities become harder to pin down. A man who once served a king may later fight under another banner, then move with a refugee group, then settle in a new region. A name recorded by Egyptian scribes may capture only one moment in a long transformation. The categories that matter to modern historians may not be the categories that mattered to people living through the upheaval. Egypt's survival has also distorted the story in subtle ways. Because Egyptian records are among the richest surviving narrative sources, the confrontation with the Sea Peoples naturally looms larger than equally important processes elsewhere that are documented mostly through ruins and scattered texts. But survival produces narrative advantage. Egypt gets to tell the story because Egypt is still there to carve it in stone. Ugarit does not get such a monument. Hattusa does not stage a triumphant inscription explaining its end. The Mycenaean palaces do not leave dramatic victory scenes. This means the Sea Peoples appear especially central, partly because the best surviving voice belongs to one kingdom that fought them and endured, and yet it would be wrong to swing too far in the other direction and dismiss them as a modern myth. Something real and dangerous is moving across the eastern Mediterranean in these years. Egyptian forces do confront enemies by land and sea. Coastal states do suffer devastation. Population movement does seem to intensify. Some new groups do emerge more visibly in the post-collapse landscape, in the southern Levant, for instance. The archaeological picture associated with Philistine settlement has long been discussed in relation to Aegean-linked migration, though the details remain debated and have grown more nuanced over time. The point is not that nothing happened. The point is that what happened was probably messier than the old narrative of a single invading people sweeping civilization away. The deeper value of the Sea Peoples question lies in how it exposes the nature of the collapse itself. Were these groups the cause, or were they the consequence? Were they destroyers from outside, or products of a system already unraveling? The most convincing answer may be that they were both destructive agents and symptoms of wider breakdown. In a world destabilized by drought, disrupted trade, imperial fatigue, local revolt, and political fragmentation, mobile armed groups gain opportunities that stable states would once have denied them. They can raid, settle, serve, defect, and adapt. They can tip already weakened regions into ruin. They can turn stress into catastrophe. By the time they appear in Egyptian reliefs as enemies of order, the old Bronze Age world may already be too damaged to resist prolonged pressure. The Sea Peoples, then, are not a complete explanation, but they are a crucial sign that the boundaries of the old system are dissolving. Populations are moving, identities are shifting. Violence is no longer contained within familiar diplomatic channels. The sea, which once carried bronze, oil, timber, and gifts between kings, now also carries fear. And in that transformation, the great mystery of 1177 BC sharpens. This is not simply a war between civilization and outsiders, but a moment when the very categories of insider and outsider begin to break apart with the world that created them. Long before archaeologists sampled pollen, counted tree rings, drilled lake beds, or read isotopes locked inside cave formations, people in the eastern Mediterranean knew what a failed season meant. They knew it in empty granaries, in fields that did not green properly, in animals growing thinner, in obligations that still had to be paid even when harvest shrank. They knew it in the rising tension between palace demands and village limits, between urban populations and the countryside that fed them. If drought is part of the story of the Bronze Age collapse, and the evidence strongly suggests that it is, then it is not simply a matter of climate graphs crossing a threshold. It is a matter of human systems discovering how little room they have for repeated failure. The attraction of climate as an explanation is obvious. It seems large enough to match the scale of the collapse. It crosses political boundaries. It can stress farms, herds, rivers, forests, shipping, migration patterns, and food prices at the same time. In recent decades, paleoclimate research has made it increasingly difficult to ignore environmental pressure. In the later 13th and early 12th centuries BC, records from pollen cores, lake sediments, marine deposits, and cave formations suggest that parts of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East experience periods of increased aridity around the time the late Bronze Age system is faltering. Scholars still debate the exact timing, regional variability, and severity. But what survives in the environmental record suggests that drought is not a decorative backdrop. It is likely one of the major stresses pressing against an already intricate and vulnerable world. That said, drought is not a magic answer. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for why some regions collapse more completely than others, or why particular centers fall in the order they do. Climate does not act alone. It works through crops, prices, politics, transport, labor obligations, and human expectations. Two societies can face reduced rainfall and produce very different outcomes depending on storage, trade access, leadership, local ecology, and political flexibility. It is not enough to say that the weather changed. The real historical question is what that change did inside systems built on concentration, hierarchy, and long-distance dependence. Agriculture in the late Bronze Age world is both local and connected. Most people still live close to the land, and the rhythms of sowing, grazing, and harvest remain the foundation under every palace and temple. But many of the great centres are no longer purely local in their survival. Palaces accumulate surplus, issue rations, support specialists, and feed officials, retainers, soldiers, and labourers whose lives depend on redistribution. Coastal cities rely not only on nearby fields but on wider exchange. Kingdoms facing local shortfalls may seek grain from elsewhere. This can soften the effects of one bad year. It can also mask the danger building underneath. If drought strikes broadly enough or repeatedly enough, the fallback options begin to disappear. One of the most revealing details in this story is how quickly food stress becomes political stress. Grain is never merely agricultural, it is legitimacy. A ruler who can feed dependents remains a ruler. A palace that can continue issuing rations appears strong even under strain. But if harvest weaken and stored reserves fall, every existing tension sharpens. Tax burdens become harder to bear. Labour corvée feels less tolerable. Merchants push harder for profitable movement of scarce goods. Soldiers and officials must still be maintained. Rural populations may hide produce, flee obligations, or resist demands more openly. Local elites may begin to act more independently if the centre can no longer guarantee stability. The chain from drought to disorder is not automatic, but it is easy to trace once enough pressure accumulates. This is one reason prolonged aridity can be more dangerous than sudden catastrophe. A flood or storm may destroy visibly, but a string of weaker harvests erodes confidence more quietly. Each year by itself may appear survivable. The first can be met from reserves. The second can be managed with imports or stricter collection. The third begins to hollow out the margin. By then, other parts of the system may already be reacting. Livestock numbers decline. Trade in bulk staples grows more urgent and less reliable. Debt, dependency, and hunger spread unevenly. The palace, trying to maintain appearances, may intensify extraction precisely when ordinary communities are least able to provide it. What survives in the record suggests that some of the old world's institutions may have responded to stress not by becoming more adaptable, but by becoming harsher. The environmental evidence is strongest when read in regional patterns rather than as a single simple line. Different proxies from Cyprus, the Levant, Anatolia, mainland Greece, and nearby regions point in related directions, though not always with perfect synchrony. Some indicate declining moisture availability. Others suggest vegetation change consistent with drier conditions and human disruption. There are also signs that river systems and local water regimes become less dependable in some areas. Scholars still debate how precisely these records align with the destruction chronology, and this caution matters. Climate archives do not speak in the same units as burned palaces, yet taken together, they point toward a world in which environmental stress is intensifying close to the same centuries in which the political and economic system begins to crack. The hardest hit regions may not always be the most visibly arid ones, but the ones least able to compensate. A kingdom with access to riverine agriculture, broad storage capacity, or alternate supply routes may endure better than a smaller state perched between fragile rainfall zones and exposed trade corridors. This may help explain some of the unevenness of collapse. Egypt, for example, though badly strained, still benefits from the Nile system and an administrative tradition built around agricultural coordination on a huge scale. That does not make Egypt immune. It does help explain why it survives when other states disappear. Elsewhere, especially in more marginal or highly dependent regions, reduced rainfall may prove far more destabilizing. There is also the question of migration. If drought reduces agricultural reliability across multiple neighboring areas, people move. Some move seasonally, some leave villages permanently, some become laborers elsewhere. Some attach themselves to military groups. Some join raiders, caravans, or migrating communities. Environmental pressure rarely produces migration in a neat wave. It produces gradients of desperation. Families sell livestock, delay sowing, abandon fields, seek patronage, or head toward coasts, river valleys, and richer lowlands. Under stable political conditions, such movement can sometimes be absorbed. Under unstable conditions, it deepens conflict. A hungry population arriving at an already stressed city is not merely a humanitarian problem. In Bronze Age terms, it is a test of whether the local system can still incorporate outsiders or whether violence will decide the matter. One lesser known but important issue is fodder. When historians think of drought, grain tends to dominate the discussion, but animals matter as much as people in many Bronze Age systems: horses for chariots, donkeys for transport, cattle for labour, sheep and goats for wool and meat, all depend on water and pasture. If grazing declines, military mobility and textile production can suffer alongside food supply. A reduction in pasture may mean fewer healthy horses, fewer transport animals, and lower resilience in exchange networks already under stress. Climate pressure thus reaches beyond the field of wheat or barley. It enters the stables, the roads, the workshops, and the military infrastructure of the state. This broadening effect is what makes drought such a compelling part of the collapse. It does not destroy palaces directly, yet it can weaken almost everything that allows palaces to function. It reduces food security, strains labour, encourages movement, worsens inequality, raises the stakes of trade disruption, and narrows the political room for compromise. In a well-buffered society, these stresses might lead to hardship without civilizational breakdown. In the late Bronze Age world, they may have arrived at the worst possible moment, pressing on systems already challenged by raiding, shifting populations, imperial rivalry, and brittle dependence on long-distance exchange. There is a temptation, especially in modern times, to seek moral simplicity in climate stories. Either climate is treated as destiny, crushing human agency beneath natural force, or it is minimized in favor of kings, battles, and migrations because those feel more dramatic and more recognizably historical. The late Bronze Age collapse resists both temptations. Climate matters here because it interacts with human choices. Drought does not automatically produce collapse. It produces stress. What follows depends on storage, distribution, coercion, adaptability, violence, and the capacity to trust that the next season will be better. When societies lose that trust, they often become more dangerous to themselves. This is why the records of scarcity, requests for aid, and signs of disrupted settlement belong in the same conversation as paleoclimate evidence. The environmental signal alone is suggestive. The human consequences make it historical. A dry interval becomes a civilizational problem when grain fails to move, when subject populations resist exactions, when kings cannot reward allies, when hungry migrants arrive, when merchants avoid dangerous routes, when palaces intensify pressure and still come up short. At that point, drought is no longer one variable among many. It has become one of the mediums through which every other weakness starts to spread. And still, drought cannot explain everything. Some regions endure. Some cities burn in ways more consistent with violence than starvation. Some powers remain capable of organized war. That is why scholars still debate the scale of environmental causation, and rightly so. The best reading is not that drought single-handedly topples the Bronze Age, but that it weakens the foundations beneath a highly interconnected world and reduces the number of mistakes that world can survive. Once resilience shrinks, Every raid bites deeper, every rebellion becomes more dangerous, every missed shipment matters more, every political failure spreads farther. If the fires of the previous section show collapse becoming visible, drought shows how it may have become unavoidable in many places before the flames ever reach the walls. Fields do not leave the dramatic traces that burned palaces do, yet the quiet failure of rain may have done as much as any army to prepare the ground for the end of the old order. The sky does not need to kill a civilization outright. It only needs to stop forgiving it. If drought weakens a civilization quietly, earthquakes destroy in a different language. They do not ask for several failed seasons. They do not wait for grain stores to shrink or diplomacy to sour. They strike in seconds, collapse walls, split foundations, open roads, damage ports, and leave behind a kind of fear that lingers long after the ground stops moving. In a world already strained by shortage, disrupted trade, and political tension, even one major earthquake can become more than a natural disaster. It can become an accelerant. The Eastern Mediterranean is no stranger to seismic violence. This is a landscape of faults, uplifts, basins, and mountain chains still restless in the present. From the Aegean to Anatolia and the Levant, earthquakes belong to the geology of everyday risk, though not everyday experience. Ancient people did not understand plate tectonics, but they knew the terror of sudden shaking, collapsing masonry, and buildings becoming traps. They also knew what it meant for walls, temples, granaries, roads, and harbour installations to be damaged in societies where repair depended on labour, timber, stone, food reserves, and central coordination. A single seismic event could be devastating. A series of them across connected regions could be transformative. This possibility has led some scholars to propose that so-called earthquake storms may form part of the Bronze Age collapse. The idea is not that one colossal quake destroys all the great kingdoms at once, but that clusters of significant seismic events along active fault systems might have struck vulnerable centres over a span of decades, adding repeated physical shocks to a world already carrying other stresses. It is an intriguing argument because it explains why some cities show destruction without obvious signs of warfare, and why a networked system could lose confidence even if no enemy army is present. Yet scholars still debate the scale of this role, and the evidence remains difficult to interpret with certainty. Earthquake damage can resemble war damage in the archaeological record, and later rebuilding can blur the distinction further. Collapsed walls alone do not settle the matter. Fire can follow both invasion and earthquake. Abandonment can follow either one. Crushed bodies under masonry may suggest seismic destruction, but even this is not always conclusive in complex urban sites. Archaeologists therefore proceed with caution. Some late Bronze Age destructions once attributed to earthquakes are now reconsidered. Others remain plausible candidates. The point is not to crown earthquakes as the hidden master cause, but to understand how seismic instability may have interacted with everything else. In a system with strong buffers, earthquake damage is costly but recoverable. In a brittle system, it can become the moment recovery stops. Imagine a major palace centre already dealing with uncertain harvests and delayed shipments. Its rulers are trying to reassure allies, maintain military readiness, and preserve elite authority. Then the ground shakes, storerooms crack, defensive walls split, workshops are damaged, roads become harder to use, harbour facilities need repair. Labour that might have gone into fields or transport is redirected to rebuilding. The centre may still survive, but not for free. Repair consumes food, timber, time and trust. If the next year also brings shortage, or raiding, or rebellion, The earthquake's true historical effect becomes visible not as isolated destruction, but as lost resilience. This is why fear matters in the earthquake story. Ancient societies are not spreadsheets. They are made of expectations. A kingdom can survive one bad harvest if people believe relief is coming. A city can survive one attack if defenses can be restored. But an earthquake introduces a different kind of uncertainty. It tells people that even stone is unreliable. A fortress on a high citadel may feel strong against armies and suddenly weak against the earth itself. Temples and palaces that embody divine and royal order become evidence of fragility when their walls crack. In periods of stability, this fear can be contained. In periods of crisis, it spreads into politics. A damaged state does not simply need to rebuild masonry, it must rebuild confidence. There is also the practical problem of concentration. The great centres of the Late Bronze Age often rely on monumental architecture, storage capacity, dense administrative compounds, and strategic fortification. These features express power, but they also create vulnerability to structural shock. A dispersed village landscape may suffer from an earthquake and continue with comparatively limited institutional loss. A palace archive, by contrast, can disappear at once if its building collapses or burns after a quake. The more a state concentrates its administration, storage, and legitimacy in major centres, the more an earthquake can damage not only physical infrastructure but political continuity itself. Some regions are more exposed than others. The Aegean and Anatolia, in particular, sit in tectonically complex zones where serious quakes are a recurring feature of the landscape. It is therefore unsurprising that earthquakes appear in discussions of Mycenaean palace destruction and the weakening of Anatolian centres. Yet the evidence remains site-specific and uneven. At one location, earthquake may seem likely. At another, warfare or internal unrest fits better. No single explanation fully accounts for the spread of collapse, and this is especially true for seismic theories. Earthquakes cannot explain drought signals, food requests, migrating populations, or the disappearance of trade in key materials. They are best understood not as the cause, but as one stress among several that may have hit some regions at especially vulnerable moments. One lesser known but revealing angle is the effect on harbours and coastal installations. Earthquakes can alter shorelines, damage quays, trigger local tsunamis, and disrupt maritime infrastructure in ways that are difficult to reconstruct archaeologically but potentially severe economically. In a world where sea trade carries metals, grain, oils, and diplomatic cargoes, damage to harbours matters far beyond the city that owns them. A port temporarily impaired may delay shipments elsewhere. A coastline shaken into instability may deter captains already worried about raiders. A harbour town trying to repair walls and docks simultaneously, while also facing food shortages, becomes a pressure point in the wider system. Then there is the question of repetition. Ancient states can often recover from one blow. What they struggle with is serial disruption. An earthquake followed by drought, a drought followed by raiding, a raid followed by political unrest, a season of instability followed by another. This cumulative logic is what makes the collapse of the Late Bronze Age so difficult to reduce to a single story. Earthquakes may not need to destroy the great kingdoms outright. They may only need to arrive at the wrong time, in the wrong places, often enough to make every other problem harder. A damaged granary matters more during food stress. A damaged wall matters more when enemies are probing borders. A damaged road matters more when supply chains are already fragile. What survives in the record suggests that ancient people sometimes responded to seismic danger with rebuilding, adaptation, and persistence. This matters because it prevents the story from drifting into fatalism. these societies were not helpless before natural disaster. They had labour systems, engineering knowledge, and traditions of repair. Cities in the eastern Mediterranean had endured earthquakes before. The question is not whether they could respond. The question is whether, in the final century of the Bronze Age, too many responses were demanded at once. This helps explain why the earthquake hypothesis remains both attractive and limited. Attractive, because it fits the geology, the archaeology of some destructions, and the broader logic of compounded stress. Limited, because it does not explain the whole geography of collapse, and cannot easily account for the political, economic, and demographic transformations visible in the written and material record. Scholars still debate which destructions are best attributed to seismic events, and the caution is warranted. Ancient ruins are eloquent, but not always specific. A wall may fall by enemy hands or by fault movement. The ashes above it may come from arson, from post-quake fire, or from later reoccupation. Interpretation demands restraint. Yet even with that restraint, earthquakes deserve a place in the story because they illustrate the larger truth of the collapse so clearly. The late Bronze Age world is not undone by one perfectly targeted blow. It is undone by the convergence of stresses that weaken its capacity to recover. Earthquakes, where they strike, are part of that convergence. They remind us that complexity is vulnerable not only to enemies and politics, but to the indifferent force of landscape itself. And perhaps more than that, they remind us of the emotional texture of living through such a time. Imagine a population already hearing rumours of raids, already watching food grow scarcer, already seeing authority strain to maintain old certainties. Then the earth moves beneath them. Walls crack. People run into streets or open courtyards. Dust rises. Aftershocks continue. The gods seem less legible than before. Merchants hesitate. Officials count damage. Labourers are redirected. Leaders promise restoration, but each promise now carries less confidence, because the world has shown how many ways it can break. That is the real significance of earthquakes in the Bronze Age collapse. Not that they explain everything, but that they expose how thin the margin of safety may already have become. A civilization that can absorb shocks survives them. A civilization already overextended begins to fear that every shock is the one that will push it past repair. By the early 12th century BC, much of the eastern Mediterranean may be living in exactly that condition, not destroyed by any single tremor, but made more fragile by every one of them. By the time outside enemies become visible in the record, another possibility has already become impossible to ignore. Some of the old world may be helping to destroy itself. Civilizations do not always fall because they are struck from beyond their borders. Sometimes they hollow from within. The palaces of the late Bronze Age are powerful, but they are also demanding. They collect, command, ration, recruit, and display. They depend on loyalty flowing downward from kings and upward from farmers. Workers, soldiers, herders, merchants, and local elites who do not all benefit equally from the order they sustain. When times are good, such systems can feel natural, even permanent. When stress rises, the same structures begin to look less like protection and more like extraction. This is the internal side of the collapse, the part that leaves fewer heroic scenes and fewer easily named villains. No great relief carving shows a society quietly losing confidence in its own rulers. No archive neatly announces that a palace has become too rigid to survive. Yet what survives in the record suggests that internal weakness matters profoundly. Political authority may be fraying. Local elites may be less cooperative. dependent populations may be less willing to meet demands. Mercenaries and military retainers may be less controllable. The old system, already pressured by environmental strain and disrupted trade, may also be increasingly unable to command obedience from those expected to carry it. The palace economies of the Late Bronze Age are highly centralized by the standards of their world. In Mycenaean Greece, the palace stands at the center of production, storage, and redistribution. In imperial systems such as the Hittite realm, great kings rely on subordinate rulers and networks of treaties that require constant maintenance. In the Levant, cities often live under the shadow of larger powers while also managing their own local interests. These arrangements can be efficient, but efficiency often depends on compliance. A palace does not harvest grain itself. A king does not physically move cargo with his own hands. The system works because countless people keep participating in it. If enough of them begin to resist, evade, withhold, flee, or simply lose faith, the administrative brilliance of the center becomes less useful. One of the deepest vulnerabilities in hierarchical systems is inequality under stress. When harvests weaken or trade falters, burdens rarely fall evenly. A palace still tries to maintain elite standards, diplomatic obligations, and military capacity. Temples still need offerings. Officials still need rations. Warriors still expect compensation. The easiest way for the center to preserve itself in the short term is often to press harder on the countryside and dependent labor. But this strategy can become self-destructive. The more a ruling system extracts from people already near their limit, the more it risks passive resistance, flight, local unrest, or open rebellion. Scholars still debate how visible such tensions are in each region, because the surviving records are largely produced by elites. Even so, the evidence remains suggestive. States under pressure often become harsher, and harshness is not the same as strength. There is also the matter of succession, always dangerous in monarchic systems. A powerful ruler can hold together alliances, suppress rivals, and command loyalty in ways that a weaker successor cannot. Dynastic instability does not need to be universal to be dangerous. A single contested succession at the wrong moment can weaken one kingdom enough to embolden enemies, delay shipments, fracture court politics, and pull local rulers into self-protective behavior. In a tightly connected world, this weakness does not stay contained. The fall or paralysis of one court can ripple outward, disrupting diplomatic balances and exposing frontier zones. The evidence for specific succession crises in the collapse remains uneven, but history makes the structural risk obvious. A world of great kings is never only as stable as its institutions, it is also as stable as the men currently sitting on the throne. Mercenaries complicate the picture further. Bronze Age states do not fight solely with citizen militias or tightly national armies in any modern sense. They often employ or absorb groups whose loyalty is practical, conditional, and connected to pay, plunder, status, or patronage. In prosperous times, this can increase military flexibility. In times of shortage, it can become a serious liability. An armed group that is not paid, or that sees the center weakening, may defect, raid, or attach itself to a rival coalition. This matters especially in an age when the difference between soldier, raider, and migrant can blur under pressure. Some of the mobile violent forces appearing in the wider collapse may owe part of their existence to states no longer able to control the armed men they once employed. Local revolt is harder to prove archaeologically than invasion, but it should not be underestimated. A burned palace does not identify its destroyers. If subject populations, overtaxed communities, displaced workers, or rival elites turn against the center, the resulting destruction can resemble external attack. Indeed, internal rebellion can be especially devastating because it strikes at the weakest joints of the system: knowledge of local terrain, control of roads, access to granaries, sympathy from the population, and familiarity with administrative routines. A foreign invader must force entry. A rebel may already be inside the gate. One lesser known but revealing possibility is that some destructions traditionally blamed on outsiders could in fact involve internal actors taking advantage of a moment when the state can no longer defend itself effectively. The Mycenaean world offers a compelling setting for this kind of interpretation. The palace system there appears powerful, but also unusually centralized. It organizes production, records labor, and channels resources through a narrow set of elite centers. That centralization creates grandeur, yet it may also create resentment and fragility. If the palace is the main organizer of life, what happens when parts of society cease to trust or support it? The destruction of palaces in mainland Greece may involve external threats, but many scholars have also considered the role of internal breakdown, factionalism, and social unrest. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every site. Still, a centralized system does not need many points of rebellion to enter crisis. It only needs enough disruption at the center to turn administrative dependence into collapse. Imperial overstretch likely deepens the problem elsewhere. The Hittite state, for instance, manages a large and varied realm through a combination of coercion, diplomacy, and delegated authority. Such empires can appear formidable right up to the moment they lose the ability to coordinate their parts. A drought in one region, unrest in another, and military pressure on the frontier can force rulers into impossible choices. Which province is reinforced first? Which ally receives grain? Which rebellious vassal is punished, and which is appeased? If communication slows and resources shrink, the empire can begin to dissolve not only from enemy pressure, but from strategic exhaustion. Subjects become less reliable when imperial protection weakens. Governors think locally. Vassals hedge their bets. The map does not need to be conquered line by line for imperial order to fail. It can simply stop being believed in. Belief may be the most fragile internal resource of all. A civilization survives many hardships if its people still trust that the system, however burdensome, remains the best path to continuity. Once that confidence breaks, compliance becomes thinner everywhere. Officials skim more aggressively. Local strongmen rise. Communities hide resources. Peripheral groups test boundaries. Soldiers calculate alternatives. This process is rarely visible in one dramatic scene. Yet it may be one of the decisive transitions in the Late Bronze Age collapse. The palaces do not only lose food, trade, or walls, they lose the assumption that their commands will continue to organize the world. There is an irony here as sharp as any in the story. The same centralization that once makes these societies powerful may make them less adaptable in crisis. A village community can reduce, retreat, improvise, and survive on a smaller scale. A palace system built on flows of tribute, prestige, and command may not know how to shrink gracefully. It either functions in recognizable form or it fails. The better it is at concentrating wealth and authority, the more dramatic the consequences when that concentration is interrupted. In this sense, the collapse from within is not separate from the collapse from without. External pressure exposes internal rigidity. Internal rigidity makes external pressure harder to resist. This helps explain why later periods often look less spectacular but more resilient. After the palace world breaks apart, many regions become smaller, poorer, and less literate in administrative terms. Yet some may also become less dependent on the survival of a few monumental centres. That is not a romantic improvement. It often means hardship, fragmentation, and loss. But it does suggest that the old order's sophistication carries costs not always visible during its golden age. Complexity is efficient. It is also vulnerable. The human consequence of internal breakdown is especially grim because it destroys social trust close to home. It is one thing to fear raiders from the sea. It is another to suspect that the man collecting grain, the local governor, the garrison commander, or the neighbouring faction no longer believes in the same order you do. Civilizations feel stable when conflict remains legible. They begin to feel terminally unstable when the line between protector and predator starts to blur. Under those conditions, people turn inward. Households, kin groups, villages, and local strongmen matter more than palaces and distant kings. The world does not end, but it contracts. By now the pattern is becoming clearer. Drought may tighten subsistence. Earthquakes may damage infrastructure. Raiders and migrating groups may exploit weakness. But none of these pressures lands on blank ground. They land on societies already carrying inequality, dependence, factional risk, and political exhaustion. Rebellion from within, whether open or quiet, whether elite or popular, may be one of the reasons the old Bronze Age world proves unable to absorb the blows arriving from every direction. The collapse is not only something that happens to these civilizations, it is also something that, in part, happens through them. When the Bronze Age world begins to fail, it does not only lose cities and kings, it loses movement. That may be the most decisive change of all. A civilization built across distance can survive war in one region, bad harvests in another, even political upheaval at a major court. So long as roads remain passable, ports remain functional, and ships continue carrying the materials that let every shortage be answered from somewhere else. But once the routes themselves become unreliable, every problem hardens, scarcity becomes isolation, delay becomes fear. The old world had been held together not just by power, but by circulation, and now circulation is starting to stop. This is where the collapse begins to look unnervingly modern in its logic. The late Bronze Age system is deeply dependent on long-distance exchange. Copper must move, tin must move, timber, oils, wine, grain, glass, crafted goods, horses, textiles, resins, and diplomatic gifts must move. Messages must move too, and with them expectations, obligations, and the confidence that help can still arrive before disaster becomes irreversible. Once enough of those flows are interrupted at the same time, the interconnected world ceases to function as a stabilizing network and becomes instead a transmission mechanism for failure. Bronze itself tells the story with brutal simplicity. Copper is widespread enough to be important, but tin is harder to find and harder to secure. Without both, large-scale bronze production falters. Without bronze, weapons, tools, fittings, and many aspects of elite and military life become harder to sustain. A palace can survive one missed shipment of luxury objects. It cannot easily preserve military credibility if access to metal becomes uncertain for too long. One of the strange underlying facts of the late Bronze Age is that some of its most powerful states are materially dependent on exchange routes extending far beyond the territories they directly control. This works beautifully in prosperity. In crisis, it becomes a trap. The sea lanes are especially vulnerable. Maritime trade is efficient, but efficiency depends on predictability. A shipmaster must believe the harbour ahead is still safe, the political situation still legible, the cargo still worth the danger, and the crew still likely to return alive. If raiding rises, if ports are damaged, if coastal cities begin falling, or if rumour alone starts to darken the horizon, fewer voyages become rational. What survives in the record suggests that this kind of maritime insecurity may spread well before every harbour is physically destroyed. Trade does not need to be fully impossible in order to collapse. It only needs to become uncertain enough that merchants, captains, and courts cannot plan around it. This uncertainty is fatal for palace systems. Palaces are not built to improvise endlessly. They are built to administer flows. They allocate bronze to smiths. They issue grain to labourers. They distribute prestige goods to allies and elites. They rely on deliveries arriving in sequence. A missed shipment is not simply one empty space in an inventory. It may halt military preparation, stall workshop output, weaken diplomatic reciprocity, and expose the centre to questions it cannot answer. How long can rations be maintained? How long can armour be repaired? How long can elite followers be rewarded? How long before the palace begins extracting more from a countryside already stretched thin? The diplomatic correspondence of the age becomes more haunting in this light. Letters requesting materials, reporting delays, or pressing for aid are not mere administrative trivia. They are signals of a system whose components are increasingly unable to count on one another. In a world of international kingship, a missing cargo is also a political event. If one court cannot send what it promised, another court must decide whether this reflects temporary strain, disloyalty, weakness, or collapse. Trust begins to erode not because rulers suddenly dislike one another, but because the infrastructure beneath diplomacy is failing. A treaty means less when grain cannot be delivered. Brotherhood between kings sounds thinner when ships stop coming. There is an important asymmetry here. Trade networks create prosperity unevenly, and they collapse unevenly too. Great centres dependent on imported raw materials can suffer quickly. Peripheral or more self-sufficient communities may be poorer, but better able to continue on a reduced scale. This helps explain one of the paradoxes of the late Bronze Age collapse. The most impressive societies are not always the most resilient. Their wealth is real, but it rests on specialization and long-distance dependence. Smaller communities may lose status and opportunity when networks fail, but they may also lose less of the structure required for daily survival. The palace falls farther because it had climbed higher. The disappearance of Ugarit from the historical stage is one of the clearest examples of what happens when connectivity becomes vulnerability. Ugarit thrives because it is plugged into everything trade, diplomacy, cultural exchange, imperial politics. That same integration leaves it acutely exposed when the roots around it turn dangerous and the powers above it can no longer guarantee security. Once the city falls, its role is not easily replaced. The network becomes thinner. Every other node carries more pressure. This is how cascading failure works. One break does not stay local. It narrows the options for everyone else. Cyprus occupies a similarly dangerous position. As a major copper source, it matters to multiple kingdoms at once. If production or transport from Cyprus is disrupted, the consequences travel far beyond the island. Scholars still debate the exact scale and timing of these disruptions, but no single explanation fully accounts for the collapse unless the vulnerability of metal supply is taken seriously. Bronze Age states are not merely trading luxuries, they are trading the very materials of military and economic order. Once those routes go silent, rulers are left managing decline with fewer tools than before. Grain movement may be even more urgent. A shortage of prestige goods humiliates elites. A shortage of food destabilizes entire societies. In good years, trade and imperial reach can cushion local harvest failure. In bad years, spread across multiple regions. The system that once redistributed relief begins to compete with itself. Cities bid against one another. States guard what they still have. Transport becomes riskier. The moral language of alliance gives way to the practical language of survival. What survives in the record suggests that appeals for food and aid become sharper, precisely because fallback options are shrinking. When grain routes fail, urban populations become far more difficult to sustain, and the countryside grows less willing to serve centres that no longer protect it. One lesser-known but telling detail is that information itself can deepen collapse when routes are insecure. News of danger travels fast enough to alter behaviour, even if the full truth is uncertain. A single report of ships attacked or a coastal town burned may lead captains to delay departure, merchants to hold back stock, and rulers to redirect military attention away from already fragile supply lines. In this sense, fear becomes economic. The system is not only losing goods, it is losing confidence in the future movement of goods. Once that confidence is damaged, people begin making rational defensive choices that collectively worsen the crisis. The diplomatic world of the Late Bronze Age is badly suited to this kind of unravelling, because it assumes a baseline of continuing exchange. Gifts, marriages, treaties, military aid, and royal courtesy all depend on movement that can be planned. Once roads and sea lanes are no longer trustworthy, diplomacy becomes more reactive and desperate. A king may still send a letter requesting support, but support delayed too long is support denied. An ally may still intend to help, but intention does not move ships through dangerous waters. Political order had relied not only on force, but on rhythm. The rhythm is breaking now. At the same time, disrupted trade feeds every other explanation already on the table. Drought becomes more dangerous when grain imports fail. Rebellion becomes more likely when palaces cannot maintain rations and rewards. Sea raiding becomes more attractive when normal commerce shrinks. Imperial overstretch becomes harder to manage when metal and food move unpredictably. Even earthquake recovery becomes more difficult when timber, labour coordination, and outside support are harder to secure. This is why trade breakdown is not just one cause among many. It is one of the central mechanisms by which multiple causes turn into a generalised system's collapse. It also helps explain why the end of the Bronze Age feels like more than the fall of dynasties. What disappears is not simply a lineup of kings, but a whole way of organising interdependence. Ports lose volume, archives fall silent, workshops shrink or vanish. Long-distance styles and goods become rarer. Literacy narrows in some places. Monumental building declines. The world becomes more local, more fragmented, and often more suspicious of distance. This is not because people stop needing one another. It is because the structures that once made large-scale cooperation reliable have failed too many times in a row. And yet the silence of the roots is never absolute. Some movement continues, some communities adapt. New exchange patterns form later. Iron slowly becomes more important. Different political landscapes emerge, but the old Bronze Age network, the one that had joined Egypt, Hatti, Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, and the Levant into a glittering if unstable international system, has lost its coherence. Its roads and sea lanes no longer guarantee order. They now carry too much uncertainty, too much danger, too many missing links. That may be the most haunting part of all. A connected world can feel permanent because every journey confirms the existence of the next harbour, the next ally, the next market, the next supply. When those confirmations stop, collapse becomes visible not only in ruins, but in absence. No ship on the horizon, no caravan at the gate, no metal in the workshop, no answer to the letter already sent. Trade routes do not merely go silent. They teach the people who depend on them that the old world has stopped answering back. After a certain point, the question is no longer why the system is under strain. The question becomes which kingdoms can still survive that strain as recognizable powers, and which simply fall out of history. By the early 12th century BC, the answer is becoming brutal. Some of the greatest states of the late Bronze Age do not merely weaken. They vanish as the kinds of political structures they had been. Their capitals are abandoned or destroyed, their archives interrupted, their administrative habits broken, their diplomatic voices gone. What remains is not always emptiness, but fragment successor states, reduced populations, altered settlements, scattered memory. The Hittite Empire is perhaps the starkest example. For centuries it stands as one of the major powers of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, able to challenge Egypt, dominate much of Anatolia, and project influence deep into Syria. It is a world of royal treaties, imperial roads, fortified centres, and careful management of subject rulers. Then, within the collapse, that imperial structure ceases to exist. Hattusa, the capital, is abandoned and destroyed in the turbulence of the age. Scholars still debate the precise combination of causes: food shortage, internal instability, enemy pressure, disruption of communications, fracturing vassal relations, but no single explanation fully accounts for how so large a power disappears so completely from the diplomatic map. The fact remains that it does. Afterward, the Hittite world survives only in partial continuation, in smaller Neo-Hittite or Syro-Anatolian kingdoms farther south and east, where pieces of language, iconography, and political tradition remain alive without restoring the old imperial whole. There is something almost chilling in the silence that follows such a disappearance. A state that once corresponded as an equal with pharaohs and other great kings no longer writes from the centre, because there is no centre left from which to write. Roads that once carried imperial commands now lead through fractured landscapes. Vassals become local rulers or fool themselves. Frontier zones stop being frontiers of an empire and become contested ground between lesser powers, migrating groups, and survivors improvising new arrangements. The empire does not end in a ceremonial final sentence. It dissolves into absence. The Mycenaean palace world offers a different but equally haunting version of vanishing. In mainland Greece, major palace centres such as Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, and Thebes suffer destruction, contraction, or severe transformation. The exact sequence differs from site to site, and some places continue in altered forms. But the palace system itself breaks down. That matters more than the survival of any one settlement. What disappears is the administrative order based on centralized storage, redistribution, and record-keeping in Linear B. The scribal world goes quiet. Monumental palace life contracts, long-distance connections shrink. Elite culture changes. The great fortified citadels remain as ruins or reduced centres, but the political and bureaucratic network that gave them meaning no longer operates in the same way. This is not the disappearance of people. It is the disappearance of a form of civilization. Communities remain in Greece. Life continues. Burial customs evolve. Local leaders still exist. Some places rebuild on smaller scales. But the palace order that had defined late Bronze Age Mycenaean power is gone, and with it goes the writing system used to manage it. One of the most startling consequences is that Greece enters centuries in which literacy, at least in the old administrative sense, disappears from the surviving record, a world that had recorded land, labour, offerings, and military arrangements falls silent in script. When later Greeks look back, the age of the palaces has already become something half remembered, half mythologized. Along the Levantine coast, the losses are more uneven, but no less profound. Ugarit, once a thriving port city deeply embedded in the international system, is destroyed and never returns to its former role. Its archives survive because catastrophe preserves them. The city itself does not survive as the kind of node it had been. This is one of the most revealing endings in the entire collapse because Ugarit had embodied the strengths of the Bronze Age network so completely. It is literate, diplomatic, maritime, commercially alive, and politically entangled. When it disappears, the loss is not merely local. A crucial connector in the wider system is removed. Similar transformations strike other Levantine cities in varied ways. Some are destroyed outright. Some continue under different populations or political patterns. Some re-emerge later in altered forms. But the urban and imperial fabric binding much of the coast into the late Bronze Age order is torn. In Canaan and surrounding regions, Egyptian influence also begins to fade from what had once been a more heavily supervised imperial zone. Garrisoned authority becomes less secure. Tributary relationships loosen or collapse. Some cities are abandoned. Others are rebuilt under changed conditions. New local identities become more visible. What had been part of a world of imperial correspondence and elite exchange becomes more fragmented and regional. Scholars still debate the pace and exact mechanisms of this transformation, but what survives in the record suggests a striking political thinning. The old map no longer holds. One lesser known but important aspect of these vanishings is how often continuity hides inside apparent disappearance. The Hittites do not evaporate as a people. Their imperial state disappears, but descendants, traditions, and political successors endure. The same is true in Greece, where populations remain and cultural memory persists even as palace administration collapses. This matters because collapse is not extinction. It is transformation under pressure, often violent, often impoverishing, but rarely total. The kingdoms that vanish do so as states, as diplomatic actors, as literate administrative systems, or as palace-based orders. The humans who lived within them continue in more local, unstable, or altered worlds. Still, the sense of loss would have been immense. Imagine living in a vassal town that once sent tribute to a great empire, and suddenly no longer knows who rules the roads. Imagine a craftsman whose livelihood depends on palace demand, finding that the palace has burned and no replacement patron exists. Imagine a scribe trained in a system that no longer has stores to count, shipments to record, or a stable court to serve. Collapse reaches each group differently. But for all of them, the disappearance of kingdoms means the disappearance of expectation. The old channels of advancement, protection, and obligation are gone. In their place comes uncertainty. The archaeological record captures this uncertainty in many small ways. Imported goods become rarer in some places. Building styles shift. Settlement sizes contract. Fortified centres may continue, but with less grandeur and narrower reach. Writing declines or changes. Material culture grows more regional. Some communities move to defensible uplands or smaller inland sites. Others stay in ruins, reusing the stones of old administrative centres for humbler needs. The grandeur of the Late Bronze Age does not end everywhere in one blaze. Often it ebbs into lesser scales, broken continuities, and adaptive survival. This uneven aftermath is precisely why the vanishings matter so much. They show that collapse is not simply the story of destruction horizons, it is the story of institutional death. A great kingdom vanishes when its archives stop, when its diplomatic role ends, when its tax and labour systems no longer organise territory, when its military hierarchy no longer functions beyond local fragments. The buildings may still stand for a while, the people may still live nearby, but the kingdom itself, as a coherent structure of power, is gone. This is what happens to the Hittite Empire. It is what happens to the Mycenaean palace order. It is what happens to several urban centres on the Levantine coast. The map of power has to be drawn again from ruins. There is also a compounding effect to these vanishings. Every kingdom that disappears makes it harder for the next to survive. If Hatti vanishes, northern Syria and Anatolia become less predictable. If Ugarit vanishes, maritime exchange loses a key node. If Mycenaean palaces vanish, Aegean participation in the network changes radically. If Canaanite cities weaken, Egypt's northern reach becomes harder to sustain. Each disappearance is therefore both a result and a cause. The system loses not only territory, but options. It becomes increasingly impossible to restore the old order because the components required to restore it are themselves no longer present. That is why the collapse feels so absolute even where life continues. The old international world depended on great centres recognizing one another, exchanging goods, letters, envoys, and prestige. Once enough of those centres vanish, the remaining powers are no longer playing the same game. Their world has changed whether they wish it to or not. Survival now means adaptation to a poorer, harsher, more local reality. Some will manage that adaptation, some will not. And so the vanishings accumulate, not everywhere, not all at once, not with the simplicity of legend, but with enough breadth that the Late Bronze Age as a system can no longer be said to exist. What had looked like a stable order of great kingdoms is revealed instead as something that could be broken beyond repair. The capitals fall silent, the roads serve smaller ambitions, the archives stop. The kings who once called one another brothers disappear from one another's correspondence because, in several cases, one of the brothers is simply gone. Egypt does not vanish, and that simple fact has a way of distorting the whole story. Because Egypt survives, it continues to speak. It leaves inscriptions, monuments, temple reliefs, and a memory of victory that later ages can still read. Next to the silence that overtakes Hattusa or the burned finality of Ugarit, Egyptian continuity can make it seem as though the Nile kingdom stood apart from the collapse, battered perhaps, but fundamentally intact. The reality is more complicated, and in some ways more revealing. Egypt survives, but survival is not the same as escape. By the time the worst of the Bronze Age crisis passes, Egypt is still there, yet it is poorer in possibilities, narrower in reach, and far less able to sustain the old imperial world around it. In the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, Egypt remains one of the greatest powers of the Eastern Mediterranean. Its agricultural base along the Nile gives it an advantage that many of its rivals lack. The annual flood, however variable in practice, offers a more dependable foundation than rain-fed systems in many neighboring lands. Its state tradition is ancient, its bureaucracy is experienced, its monuments and temples project an aura of continuity that few kingdoms can match. This is exactly why Egypt's struggle during the collapse matters so much. If even Egypt is forced into defensive crisis, then the scale of the broader breakdown must be taken seriously. The inscriptions of Merneptah and Rameses III present Egypt as the defender of order against hostile outsiders, including groups modern historians place under the label of the Sea Peoples. The reliefs are dramatic. Enemies appear in battle by land and sea. Pharaoh triumphs. The proper world is restored through royal power. There is truth in this, but also performance. Egyptian royal inscriptions are never neutral reports. They are statements of legitimacy and control. What they reveal, perhaps despite themselves, is how serious the danger has become. A kingdom confident in effortless dominance does not need to carve such elaborate scenes of defense. Egypt is fighting hard because the old balance beyond its frontiers is already failing. One of the critical differences between Egypt and several other Bronze Age powers is ecological and administrative depth. The Nile Valley provides concentrated agricultural strength. The Egyptian state has long experience in managing grain, labor, and distribution on a very large scale. This does not make Egypt invulnerable. It does help explain why it can absorb shocks that are fatal elsewhere. A drought affecting the wider eastern Mediterranean may still hurt Egypt, especially if Nile conditions are unfavorable or regional exchanges disrupted. But Egypt possesses a stronger internal food base than many rain-dependent kingdoms. A weakened Hittite state can disappear when its wider networks fail. Egypt has more room to endure. That room, however, is not infinite. The threats Egypt faces are not only military, they are systemic. The empire it had projected into Canaan becomes harder to maintain as Levantine cities are disrupted. Local powers change, and the wider diplomatic order breaks apart. Foreign trade grows less predictable. Military campaigning becomes more defensive. Resources once used for influence abroad are drawn back toward the protection of the homeland. What survives in the record suggests that Egypt is no longer operating from effortless strategic confidence. It is reacting to a world in which familiar buffers are disappearing. This shift is visible in the very nature of Egyptian victory. Rameses III defeats enemies. Yes, but victory in this context is defensive preservation rather than the expansionist certainty of earlier ages. Egypt does not use these successes to rebuild the international system around it. It cannot. The Hittite Empire does not reappear because Egyptian armies hold their ground. Ugarit is not restored to its former place. The Mycenaean palace world does not revive. Egypt may repel immediate threats, but it is repelling them inside a world that is already changing beyond recovery. It survives into a diminished international landscape. One lesser known but revealing detail is how costly survival can be. Defensive warfare is expensive. Maintaining armies, fleets, fortifications, and internal provisioning under conditions of instability requires enormous resources. A state can win battles and still exhaust itself doing so. Egypt's later New Kingdom history suggests strains in labor, administration, and royal authority that become increasingly visible after the Great Confrontations. Tomb robberies, labor disputes, fiscal pressure, and weakening central control in subsequent generations all point toward a kingdom whose structural strength is being tested. Scholars still debate the precise links between these later developments and the collapse horizon, but the broad picture is clear enough. Egypt survives the storm, yet it does not emerge with the same reserve of power it once possessed. There is also the psychological dimension of losing the world around you. Egypt had long operated in relation to recognizable great powers and vassal territories, diplomacy with Hatti, management of Levantine dependencies, engagement in international exchange, and awareness of rival courts all formed part of how Egyptian power was expressed. When those counterparts disappear or weaken drastically, Egypt is not simply relieved of burdens, it is deprived of the very arena in which late Bronze Age kingship had taken shape. A great power surviving alone in a poorer world is not the same as a great power flourishing among peers and rivals. Prestige itself changes when the stage shrinks. Archaeologically and politically, the aftermath confirms this. Egypt remains a state, but its overseas influence contracts. The Levant becomes more contested and less obedient. New peoples and local powers emerge where old imperial arrangements once held. Mediterranean exchange patterns alter. The cost of projecting force outward rises while the returns diminish. Over time, Egypt enters a world that historians increasingly call the Iron Age, a world of different political forms, different strategic calculations, and less of the integrated palace diplomacy that had defined the late Bronze Age. Survival, in other words, carries Egypt forward into a transformed era it did not choose. This makes Egypt one of the most important pieces of evidence against simplistic collapse narratives. If the Bronze Age world had been destroyed by one all-conquering people, Egypt's continued existence would be hard to explain. If drought alone had dictated outcomes, Egypt's survival would need to be read very differently than that of inland empires. If internal revolt alone were the answer, Egypt's defensive battles would sit oddly in the record. Instead, Egypt suggests a more layered picture. A state with ecological advantages, deep institutions, and substantial military capacity can withstand the convergence of stresses better than many of its rivals. But even it cannot preserve the old order whole. Egypt survives because it is strong. It is changed because the world around it is no longer survivable in its old form. The contrast with the vanished powers is especially instructive. Hatti disappears. Mycenaean palaces collapse. Ugarit burns and does not return as before. Egypt remains. Yet this remaining is not triumph in the fullest sense. It is endurance. The difference matters. Endurance means accepting contraction, greater insecurity, and the loss of the interconnected system that had once magnified Egyptian influence. The inscriptions can celebrate victory. And from Egypt's own perspective they are right to do so, but from the wider perspective of history, those victories are part of a defensive last stand in an age when the old Bronze Age order is dying. Ordinary Egyptians, like ordinary people elsewhere, would have felt this not as an abstract civilizational label but as altered life. Grain supply, taxation, military demands, labor obligations, and perceptions of royal competence all matter more when the state is under pressure. A kingdom can remain formally intact while life inside it becomes harder, more anxious, and less secure. In that sense, Egypt is not separate from the collapse at all. It is one of its survivors. And survivors often carry the strain of what they outlast. There is also a lesson here about history's bias toward those who leave records. Egypt's monuments speak with such authority that they can make survival look simpler than disappearance. But silence elsewhere should not be mistaken for lesser suffering, nor Egyptian inscription for complete clarity. Egypt tells us what it wants to tell us that order holds because Pharaoh holds it. What survives in the wider archaeological and regional record suggests something more fragile. Pharaoh may indeed hold the line, but he does so against the tide of a system no single kingdom can restore. Egypt can win its battles and still lose its world. That may be the truest way to understand its place in 1177 BC. Egypt is not the exception that disproves the collapse. Egypt is the proof of how large the collapse is. Even the strongest state in the region is forced into a struggle for preservation. It survives, but in surviving it reveals the scale of what has been lost. The great international age of palace diplomacy, maritime wealth, bronze-fueled power, and interconnected courts does not continue because Egypt remains standing. It ends with Egypt still on its feet, looking out over a landscape of burned cities, vanished kings, weakened frontiers, and sea lanes that no longer promise the same world they once did. After the fall of the great palace world, the eastern Mediterranean does not become empty. It becomes unfamiliar. That is a different kind of loss, and in some ways the more enduring one. The old order of great kings, tightly managed archives, bronze-fed armies, and international cargoes does not vanish into a blank space. It breaks into smaller worlds. Some are poorer, some are more mobile, some are less literate, less monumental, less centralized. New communities appear in old ruins. Old coastlines receive new settlers. Former imperial territories harden into regional mosaics. These entries after 1177 BC are not merely an aftermath. They are a long reassembly, improvised out of wreckage. This is one of the reasons the Bronze Age collapse has to be handled with care. The phrase collapse can suggest a cliff edge followed only by darkness, but what follows is not only darkness, it is transformation, often harsh and disorienting, but also creative in ways no one living through the destruction could have predicted. Still, the creativity comes at a cost. Populations move because old systems fail to hold them. Writing shrinks or disappears in some places because the institutions that once required it are gone. Monumental architecture becomes rarer because smaller societies cannot command the same labour or do not organise power in the same fashion. Trade continues, but at lower volume and often along different lines. The world narrows before it opens again in new forms. In Greece, the end of the Mycenaean palace order ushers in a period long remembered as obscure. The great administrative centres are no longer the engines they were. Linear B disappears from use. Population in some areas contracts or disperses. Material culture becomes more regional and often simpler in visible terms. Yet this is not a total void. Communities survive. Pottery traditions evolve. Burial practices shift. New patterns of local leadership emerge. Some settlements move to more defensible locations, suggesting that insecurity remains part of daily life. The loss of palace bureaucracy may mean less large-scale coordination, but it also means the old hierarchy has broken. A new social landscape, less centralized and less internationally entangled, begins to take shape. Later Greek memory will look back through epic and legend, dimly preserving echoes of a richer and more violent age. This is one of the strangest legacies of the collapse. A literate palace world falls silent, and centuries later a different Greece emerges that remembers something of lost kings, great citadels, sea journeys, and wars, but through poetry rather than archives. What disappears in administration may survive in cultural memory, distorted but persistent. Collapse changes not only institutions, but the form in which the past itself is carried forward. In Anatolia and northern Syria, the imperial disappearance of the Hittites gives way to successor states that preserve fragments of the old order without rebuilding it at full scale. Neo-Hittite or Syro-Anatolian kingdoms continue in parts of the region, maintaining elements of language, iconography, and rulership. This continuity matters because it shows that imperial collapse does not erase cultural inheritance. At the same time, the political geography is transformed. What had once been organized from a great inland capital is now distributed across smaller, more vulnerable centers. Local adaptation replaces imperial coordination. The map has fewer broad certainties and more regional improvisations. In the Levant, the centuries after collapse are filled with movement and redefinition. Some cities recover under altered circumstances. Others never regain their earlier role. New populations or newly visible identities emerge more clearly in the archaeological record, including groups associated with the Philistine world in the southern coastal Levant, where Aegean-linked material influences appear in telling ways. Scholars still debate the exact scale and nature of migration, acculturation, and local continuity. But what survives in the record suggests a landscape where identities are becoming more fluid and more local. Egyptian hegemony fades. Former vassal relationships weaken. Small kingdoms and city-states begin to matter differently. The old imperial grammar of the region is no longer the only language of power. Cyprus, too, changes rather than disappears. Its role in metal production and trade remains important, but the systems surrounding it are altered. Some sites show continuity, others disruption. Networks are reoriented. The island's position in the sea ensures that it remains significant. Yet the world in which that significance operates is no longer the same Bronze Age circuit of great palaces and royal correspondence. Adaptation here, as elsewhere, means negotiating reduced certainty. An island that once helped feed a vast and stable bronze economy must now function in a more fragmented and shifting environment. One lesser-known but important feature of the post-collapse world is that smaller scales can sometimes be more resilient. A village society with fewer dependencies may not produce monumental halls, international archives, or fleets of cargo ships, but it may survive repeated shocks better than a palace system requiring constant long-distance supply. This does not mean the post-collapse centuries are preferable in any easy sense. They are often materially poorer and politically harsher. It does mean that the disappearance of complexity can, in some places, create new forms of endurance. A less impressive world may be a more survivable one. At the same time, hardship remains everywhere in the background. When literacy declines, records narrow, and building programs shrink, it is easy to romanticize the resilience of the survivors. But survival in these centuries likely means insecurity, local conflict, reduced access to goods, and the constant work of rebuilding life without the protections, however unequal, once offered by larger systems. The farmer, potter, herder, fisher, and local warrior all inherit a landscape in which the old roots are less reliable, the old authorities less meaningful, and the old wealth more often encountered as ruin than as living structure. And yet something new is forming in these centuries of contraction. Iron gradually becomes more important, though the shift is uneven and slow rather than a sudden technological revolution. Political organization begins to reappear in different patterns. Phoenician maritime expansion will later reshape parts of the Mediterranean. In the Levant and beyond, new kingdoms emerge. In Greece, the long road eventually leads toward the archaic world, Assyria, which survives the collapse better than many of its rivals, will later rise with renewed force into a transformed Near East. The post-collapse period is therefore not simply the death of one world, it is the rough ground from which several later worlds begin. What survives in the record suggests that memory itself changes tone after such a break. The great palace world becomes a source of ruins, legends, inherited fragments, and puzzling remnants. A toppled wall can be reused. An old seal can outlive the office that once gave it power. A scribal habit can vanish for centuries. Landscapes accumulate layers of forgetting. People continue to live among the remains of systems they no longer fully understand, or understand only through local stories. This is one of the most haunting consequences of collapse, not only that institutions die, but that later generations inherit their shells without inheriting their full meanings. The centuries after 1177 BC also reveal that interconnection itself does not end permanently. Human societies reconnect. Trade routes return in altered forms. Maritime confidence revives. New political structures learn to work across distance again. But those later recoveries emerge from a long period in which the cost of complexity has been made brutally clear. The Bronze Age world had shown how much power interdependence could generate. Its collapse teaches how much risk that same interdependence can hide. The new worlds that follow are built with, against, and through that lesson. This is why the aftermath matters as much as the destruction. If the story ended only in fire, it would be tragic but simple. Instead, it extends into generations of adaptation, migration, memory loss, and gradual reorganization. Whole regions learn to live without the old international order. Some communities become more inward-looking, others become more mobile. Some preserve scraps of the past. Others reinvent themselves so thoroughly that the old age survives only in stone blocks beneath newer walls. The collapse, then, is not only the fall of kingdoms, it is the breaking open of the future. The world after 1177 BC is smaller in many ways, but it is not finished. It is unsettled, fragmented, and often afraid. Yet inside that smaller world are the beginnings of later civilizations, later literatures, later empires, and later memories of the age that had burned. New worlds do not arrive cleanly. They emerge in the smoke of the old one, carrying forward fragments they did not choose and abandoning much they can no longer sustain. By now the shape of the mystery has changed. The question is no longer simply how so many civilizations collapsed. It is also how human societies continued afterward what they kept, what they lost, what they forgot, and what they built from the wreckage. In that slow rebuilding lies the true scale of the event. A system that had taken centuries to assemble falls apart, and the Eastern Mediterranean spends generations learning how to live without it. By now, after the burned palaces, the vanished kingdoms, the failed harvests, the broken routes, the migrations, the internal unrest, and the survivors left standing in a poorer world, the temptation is to ask for a final answer simple enough to close the case. What caused the collapse? Who did it? Which force matters most? Historians, archaeologists, and scientists have spent generations turning that question over. And the reason it remains so compelling is that the evidence refuses to narrow itself into a single clean cause. The Late Bronze Age collapse did not happen because one people attacked, or because one drought struck, or because one fault line moved, or because one dynasty failed. It happened because a complex world lost the ability to absorb stress from many directions at once. That may sound less satisfying than a single villain, but it is far more revealing. The Bronze Age system is not fragile in the sense of being weak or poorly made. It is fragile in the deeper sense that accompanies all sophisticated systems built on high levels of coordination. Its strength depends on constant movement across long distances, on legitimacy flowing through hierarchy, on raw materials arriving from afar, on agricultural stability supporting concentrated populations, on elites continuing to believe in the rewards of the system, and on violence remaining containable inside familiar political rules. Once several of those conditions begin to fail together, the old order does not merely bend, it starts to unravel through its own connections. This is why no single explanation fully accounts for the collapse, yet several explanations remain indispensable. Drought matters because it narrows the margin of food security and turns every administrative demand sharper. Earthquakes matter because physical shock is harder to recover from when labour, transport, and morale are already strained. Mobile raiders and migrating groups matter because weakened coastlines and failing kingdoms create openings for violence and resettlement on a scale stable states could once resist. Internal rebellion matters because heavily centralized systems can lose control not only to enemies, but to their own exhausted subjects, their own ambitious elites, and their own unpaid armed men. Trade breakdown matters because once the roads and sea lanes stop functioning reliably, every local crisis becomes harder to offset from elsewhere. Remove any one of these pressures, and the Bronze Age world might still have survived in altered form. Let them converge, and survival becomes much harder. The best way to think about 1177 BC may be not as a single date of destruction, but as the visible centre of a system's collapse. In some regions the damage begins earlier, in others it continues later. Some powers fall fast, others endure in diminished form, but the broad pattern remains unmistakable. The great interconnected world of the Eastern Mediterranean, which had made kings richer, states stronger, and trade more ambitious than before, had also created interdependence so deep that failure could travel as efficiently as success. A shortage in one region became a burden in another. A fallen city weakened its neighbours. A disrupted cargo left workshops idle, armies undersupplied, and diplomacy thinner. A frightened captain or hungry village could become part of a much larger historical cascade without ever meaning to. In that sense, the hidden cause of the collapse may be interdependence itself, not because connection is a mistake, but because connection changes the scale of consequence. A simple society can suffer hardship and remain locally legible. A highly integrated one can appear stable for generations and then fail with astonishing breadth once enough parts stop supporting one another. The Bronze Age world does not collapse despite being connected. It collapses through the very pathways that had once made it dazzling. This is also why the event feels so modern even at a distance of more than 3,000 years. The palaces, chariots, copper ingots, cuneiform tablets, and fortified citadels belong to a vanished age, but the logic beneath them does not. Systems that maximize efficiency often reduce slack. Systems that reward specialization often increase dependence. Systems that centralize authority often struggle to adapt when conditions change faster than commands can travel. The late Bronze Age collapse matters not only because ancient cities burned, but because it reveals a permanent truth about complexity. Prosperity can accumulate hidden risk, and stability can become most dangerous when it persuades its participants that the structure around them is more durable than it really is. At the same time, the collapse resists becoming a parable too neatly aimed at the present. Ancient people are not placeholders for modern anxieties. Their world has its own ecology, politics, technologies, and assumptions. The evidence remains incomplete. Scholars still debate chronology, causation, and regional variation. What survives in the record suggests layered probabilities, not perfect certainty. That uncertainty is not a flaw to be scrubbed away. It is part of the dignity of the subject. The ruins tell us a great deal, but they do not flatter us with total explanation. They leave room for inference, restraint, and the unsettling knowledge that even major civilizations can pass into silence without leaving a single document that says clearly, all at once, this is why we ended. One lesser known but important lesson lies in what did not collapse completely. Egypt survives, though diminished. Assyria survives and later rises into new prominence. Smaller communities endure where palaces fail. Successor states preserve fragments of vanished empires. This unevenness matters because it shows that resilience is not distributed according to prestige alone. Some of the most impressive systems are also the most exposed. Some of the humbler survivors endure precisely because they require less coordination, less imported material, and less faith in distant stability. The collapse is not a moral judgment. It is an exposure of how different kinds of societies carry risk. And perhaps that is why 1177 BC continues to haunt the imagination. It is not only the spectacle of destruction, it is the sensation of standing at the edge of a world that had every reason to believe in its own continuity. Kings still wrote to one another, ships still sailed, palaces still counted their stores, chariots still stood ready, priests still tended rites, administrators still issued orders. The system remained visible right up until the point when it no longer held. Collapse did not arrive as a mythic thunderclap. It arrived as overlapping realities that, one by one, moved from manageable to unmanageable. By the time the full pattern became visible, much of the old order had already become impossible to restore. So what caused so many civilizations to collapse at once? Not one thing, but a convergence. Not one enemy, but many pressures. Not one disaster, but a reduction of resilience so severe that disasters began to reinforce one another. Drought tightened the grain supply. Trade disruption cut off relief. Political systems grew harsher and less flexible. Rebellion and migration spread. Earthquakes and warfare damaged infrastructure. Coastal insecurity frightened ships from the sea. Great powers lost their partners, then their buffers, then their confidence, and once enough of the network failed, the rest of it could no longer pretend to be a world. That may be the final answer. If there is one, the late Bronze Age collapsed because it had become too richly connected, too centralized, too dependent on uninterrupted flow, and too stressed by converging shocks to recover in its old form. The ruins of 1177 BC are therefore not only the remains of what was destroyed, they are the remains of a world discovering too late that its greatest achievements had bound it together tightly enough to fall together too. The wind down begins where the noise ends, after the battles, after the letters stop, after the roofs collapse and the storehouses burn, and the roads carry more refugees than merchants. There is still a landscape. The sea is still there, moving against the harbours that once sent cargoes toward royal courts. The plains still wait for rain. The hills still hold the outlines of walls built by kings whose names are now broken on clay or worn thin on stone. In the end, collapse does not erase the world. It leaves people inside it, listening to a silence that did not exist before. That may be the strangest part of this story. Civilizations feel immense while they are alive. They seem permanent because they are everywhere at once in taxes, in trade, in language, in ritual, in architecture, in the assumptions people make about where protection comes from and where power lives. Then the structure fails, and what remains is not only ruin but memory loosening from its anchors. A palace becomes a mound, a road becomes a path between fields, a harbour becomes a quieter shore. The great international age of the Bronze Age does not end in one final scene. It fades into smaller lives lived among its remains. And yet those lives continue. Someone still plants seed in uncertain ground. Someone still repairs a wall with stones taken from an older wall. Someone still launches a boat into waters that once carried empires. Children grow up in the shadow of ruins without fully knowing what stood there before. New kingdoms slowly form. New languages rise into writing. New stories take shape. The world after collapse is diminished, but it is not empty. It is human in a different register, closer perhaps to weather, hunger, local loyalty, and the hard work of beginning again without the confidence that once seemed natural. Perhaps that is why 1177 BC lingers so powerfully, not because it is only about destruction, but because it is about fragility hidden inside brilliance. The more dazzling the old world becomes, the more moving its disappearance feels, and the more familiar. A connected civilization can seem invincible right up until the moment its own connections begin to fail. So the last image is not of a king or a battle, but of a coastline at dusk. Behind it lie burned cities, broken treaties, and the exhausted end of an age. Ahead of it lies another world not yet fully born. Between the two is a long silence, filled with wind, salt, memory, and the quiet persistence of those who remain.